right. Uh,
Thank you all for joining us today for today's webinar, The Evolution of EMDR, a really cool fireside chat between two industry greats, Paula Merucci of EMDR Chicago and Roy Kiessling of EMDR Consulting. So this is going to be a really fun conversation. We'll run from about now until about 3:30 Central Time, 4:30 Eastern, 2:30 Mountain, 1:30 Pacific, and then for those out of the country, you can do math. That's really hard for us here today. We're really excited to have it. This is for MDRIA credit, so if you can please turn on your cameras except during break, that'll help us track attendance. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We'll be collecting those as we go. And then during the Q&A breaks, I'll be throwing the questions up to Paula and Roy. We will change the chat to just chatting with me. So if you have any questions, you just send them my way. Whether it's tech stuff, I'm here to support, but then also keep the conversation going because we know for those that have taken trainings with these two illustrious trainers, they can chat. They're good at that chatting about, especially about the trauma and dissociation and all the great things that we are here to learn about. I'm excited. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Paula and Roy.
okay. All right, Roy, why don't you take it away? I've been talking for the last 10 minutes already.
Well, I think number one, I want to thank Paula for putting this together and Andy to be that logistics person that's going to make it all happen behind the scenes. And a little background, when Paula invited me, I said, wow, this is a wonderful opportunity because just to share a little bit about Paula, when she joined our organization, she came out to Hawaii for training. And during the training, she was sitting back in the back. I'm not sure doing what, but every evening at lunch, every evening she'd come out with a notebook full of paper of questions to ask, and she would just fire question after question after question. And my wife pointed out the fact that usually turn into a zombie at about 7 o'clock in the evening, and Paula kept me going into the wee hours of the night every night with questions, and has continued to do that. And part of what I really appreciate about Paula is she really looks at all the steps and the procedures and the nuances and brings up questions I'd never thought about. And so I think we're going to look forward to a really fun day of bringing up things. I'm sure Paula's going to have her own questions to ask, as well as what you might be curious about. And I think probably the other thing that motivated this is I'm finding myself to be one of the elder statesmen. Since I've been in this business of EMDR since 1995. And I've had opportunities to work with Francine personally, as well as her wonderful training team, and a lot of others. So I'm just, we haven't done any prep work. This is going to be a lot of just questions, and let's just fire away and be curious and have our conversation. As Andy said, when Paula gets started, she gets me going. So thank you very much, Paula, for putting this all on, and having 1,000 or more is just a wonderful way to reach out and be able to learn a little bit and appreciate the time spent together. So thank you.
Yes, yes. I think it's a huge testament to the work that we do and to all the people out there that are making a difference in what can be seem like an unsettling world right now. So, Roy, I would actually like for you to kind of take us back to maybe the early 1990s, just give us an idea of how you entered into this work and the relationships that you had and what you saw. And I really am going to let you start us off.
Okay. Well, I usually always, when they ask this, I got to be a social worker through a very unusual path. First of which I was a pilot for the Marine Corps. Never fought in combat, fortunately, but I did that for a number of years. And then I became a tennis professional, teaching professional, not a player per se, until 1985. And then those careers ended, and I got into social work in middle age and got into individual counseling and was introduced to EMDR by one of my colleagues. I got the little flyer, and like most people in the early 1990s, what in the world is this, with eye movements back and forth? But they had known me and they encouraged me to take this modality. I was primarily trained as a gestaltist. And they said, your style of being playful and experimenting around and dealing with affect is something you're comfortable with, and you might like this modality. And I read the book before I went to the training. Back then, it was done in two parts. And I did the first part in Columbus, Ohio with K Work. I originally then lived in Cincinnati, so that was just an hour drive up the road. And then you were supposed to wait 4 to 6 months before you did part two. And I wanted to hear from Francine, and she was actually up in Chicago about 4 weeks later. And I went up to Chicago and enrolled in that along with the other 300 people in the room. And at that time, she was very flamboyant. She would come walking in with long gowns on, almost looked like a wizardy, a female wizard that was very excited about that. And like everybody else, just kind of jumped in and tried to start doing the process. And I had felt almost committed to follow through. I had given a lot of the clients I had the heads up that I was going to be learning EMDR, and from what I'd read, it would be probably a good fit. At the time, I was working with people with eating issues, primarily weight management, not the far end of the continuum with anorexia, bulimia, but just yo-yo dieting. And that had a lot of already historical roots that many of their eating patterns started in the past. And lo and behold, we found that years later, that became one of Shapiro's kind of foundational components with her book, Getting Past Your Past, which really sets it all in play that a lot of the things that we're doing are from the past. So I just jumped in and started doing that. And as I said, I've trained everything I've done. I've offered workshops and done training. So by 95, I finished my training. By 97, the Institute, Francine's organization, was beginning to expand exponentially, and they started inviting more people in to be their coaches, or they call facilitators. And I got into the very first training of facilitators, and they were called red badges, where we would have to go and kind of be watched by fully sort of certified facilitators. We'd have to practice and show how well we learned to do that. And that was the red badging process that took about 3 or 4 treatment sessions, training sessions before you became a full-time coach. And so that was really the start of just getting introduced and becoming part of the Institute's organization. And I think probably the next biggest shift was in 1998, they had a huge project that Francine put together with UNICEF over in Bangladesh. And they were going over in teams, for training teams, like every 2 weeks. They send training teams over. And the organizer of that was Steve Silver, who was one of Francine's senior trainers. And that was probably one of my connections that allowed me to move into that next layer of involvement. Was that Steve Silver was also a Marine, and he was also in the air wing. He was a radar intercept operator, which is the backseat person in the F-4, which was an interceptor. And the plane that I flew was a two-seated bomber, and so my navigator would be following me. And so we kind of made that connection, just as from the Marines and from the pilots. And he invited me as part of that first training team to be going to Bangladesh. And actually, at that time, we realized that this was by 98. So this is Francine been teaching EMDR for now, 6, 7 years. And it was really the first time that I realized that were a lot of people who were very highly educated in Bangladesh who we could not teach because you had to be a master level clinician, and you could only learn EMDR from that. And you were only learning one speed, which is the EMDR. And it was even that early in 1998 when I began to realize there's got to be some other way to pare this down to get out to the NGOs, to the non-government organizations, and teach the masses. Because in Bangladesh, we were training 65 clinicians in a city of 3 million people. And so it was really that first part. And so that was the first introduction to let's do a little bit of changing. So, that was also by then, the next step was they had an EMDR Institute discussion list that Andrew Leeds had put together, which was an international discussion list of people bringing up questions. Back in the 90s, there was no consultation. We just learned it and jumped in on our own and were kind of isolated. So the Institute had put together, through Andrew Leeds's organizational skills, the Institute discussion list. And by 1998 or 9, he was kind of burnt out from doing that and pleaded for people to do somebody to take over that for him, and nobody would do it. And I just loved to teach again. And I had already started responding to some of the questions on the listserv. And so I volunteered. And I think that was probably one of the most important aspects of my journey was I started to read problems from all those who had taken the training. They were the same problems over and over again. Case formalization, how do you keep clients in the windows of tolerance? How do I help anticipate everything that's happening? So that's a pretty good chunk of the first few years. Maybe we'll kind of pause for a moment and if that's tweaked any interest that you have from there.
Well, I do love when you picked up that listserv. I think that, like you said, just building on what you've already referred to, that you were able to kind of put your finger on the pulse of the therapists that were using this. You were able to kind of get firsthand how things were going out there with it. And what were some of the things that you saw?
Well, I think the most important part was case formalization. When
Mhm.
Francine started EMD, if everybody remembers that story, it was for single incident trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder. And that was done in the late 1980s. And that was when we had a surge of understanding trauma at that traumatic level, at least. And so I think there was more. The client walks in, they have been in an automobile accident, they've been attacked, they're military combat. So it just cue this up and do it. And EMD was really tightly held. So there was really a very minimal amount of how to formulate a case, how to look at it. So these were more solution oriented kind of crisis interventions more so than anything else. And so I think her basic preparing the client is based on that. Plus, I think she really felt your clinicians already, you know how to do biopsychosocials, you know how to do case formalization. Well, this is just taking care of one event and desensitizing it. And so I think that was probably one of the most important aspects that came out of the case formalization. How do we put something together to understand what the client's going to do? And I think that was the most glaring of the areas. And familiar with Francine's book, she'll talk a lot about doing those things you do as therapists as far as rapport and relationship and attunement. And then her only strategy for targets the process was write down 10 things that bothered you. And probably in the 1990s, that was okay. We had reasonably healthy people who were seeking out treatment. I don't think therapy was quite the mainstream as it is now. And those who probably needed it were reluctant to get it or didn't have access to it back in the 90s. So I think it was a good start. But I think that was the first real motivator that came out of the initial part. I think the second part was in 2001. I think because of my work with Bangladesh, because I had been facilitating for all the trainers, and my connection with Steve Silver, and me being on the listserv, I was invited at the very last minute. I got a call in November from Robbie Dunton, who was executive director, very, very close friend with Francine, saying they had an opening for the first training of trainers for the humanitarian program. And the humanitarian program prior to that was using the 5, 6 already trained EMDR clinicians to do volunteer work, mostly overseas. But there was a growing interest and demand for EMDR to be learned in agency settings in the United States. So they started recruiting a small group of people to go to Francine, spend the weekend with her to become a trainer for training. And Jim Knipe was one of those. You might remember Jim Knipe,
Mhm.
recognize Jim Knipe from the EMDR Toolbox. And also Bob Tinker was a second one. And Bob was the first author of Through the Eyes of a Child, the first book that was published that way. And any of you who might have watched what we call the Mary tape of this elderly woman dying of cancer, and what was the phenomenal outgrowth of that whole process, that was Bob Tinker conducting that with his wife Sandra Wilson, who was a researcher, and they did a replication of her product. So I think that kind of opened me up to the next layer of becoming a trainer. And I think a lot of the development then was more around how do we make training safe? How do we make training sufficient? How do we make trainings one where the clinicians feel confident? And I think that started opening up, again, a lack of treatment planning, how to organize things, as well as how to manage them. So I think the listserv, as well as the training, started to get larger with concerns about how do we manage this process, how do we organize it, and how do we manage it. And I think that was sort of the or early 2000s. So from probably my involvement in 98 to 2004 or 5, 95 actually, from 95 to 2005, uh, was kind of figuring things out. And before we started, started talking about how to organize these treatment plans, and it really is around cognitions, our approaches around beliefs. And the very first introduction I got to that was the first conference I went to by Andrea, and it was with two people who had put a lot of emphasis on schemas. William Zangwall was a trainer for Francine at the time, and Jeffrey Young was a publisher of schema focused therapy, and they really kind of started using the cognition, and that became the way it started to appear to me to organize things around the cognition, just a simple cognition, to define that aspect of it. So I think those all kind of played together. But certainly coming out of the listserv and hearing the same concerns over and over again, and then especially once I became a trainer, a lot of my uh, thoughts of problem solving and figuring EMDR out had more to do with how do I train people than it did how I treat people.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Just I want to put out there because I know that these were questions that I kept asking you as I became an EMDR basic trainer is the cognitions were associated with the PTSD one-time criterion A event. And as we were assessing and you were learning through the listserv, our therapists were meeting with complex clients, complex PTSD. And so you made this transition into, what you called neural networks. You gave it a visual where there was a triangle that represented neural networks. I have dyslexia. So the minute that I saw your visuals, that was one of the things that really attracted me to your work. Can you talk a little bit about that transition for you? Because that's a really important one, the difference between a cognition and a belief and the neural networks, a whole past, present, future that we're working with.
Yeah, sure. Well, if you look back, I think I was asked these questions before, and I did a little Google search with ChatGPT about when did neural networks even become known neurologically, and it wasn't until the early 2000s. So in part, you have to give credit to Francine for that kind of intuitive leap of faith to say there's something going on here. We don't know the names for it yet. We don't have the language for it yet. Um, and I think the first approach for those who were trained way back then was to look at targets were the issue. The node of the problem was the incident that was the automobile accident or the assault. And I remember her teaching us how to hold our hand, and hold it upside down. So this is your target. And then once you start processing, yeah, Paula's got it. You have all these channels of association that would come out of that event. And that was really the standard model, and in many respects still is in many different training environments today. But I think probably the most dramatic to me was, and I was trained in that single event trauma coming out. And what we found out was what appeared to be rather simple problems turned into complex. So I think you mentioned, Paula, we started treating complex clients, and I would add that we didn't know they were complex. We thought they were just showing up with a problem. And initially, that was one of the fascinating things about EMDR was the insights that occurred once you started this problem. Oh, wow, isn't that an interesting insight? You never made the connection to the automobile that went to here. That was really fascinating to sit back as the clinician and for the client to get those insights. And it still is one of the most powerful parts of EMDR, almost like free association and psychoanalysis on steroids. But I think what really threw me to realize this got to be a better way was somewhere around 98 or thereabouts. I was working in a mental health agency, and I had a young woman coming in, very high functioning apparently, but she came in and said, I have this ongoing anxiety of almost phobic response when I get on a bus. And especially if it's a hot bus, I start getting really nauseous. I get anxious. I feel powerless. I feel trapped. I want to try to work on that. And it happened even after that. She said, and I know exactly when it started. She said, I have the insight. I know exactly what started this all. And it was a time when I was about 10 or 11, going to school on a hot summer day. The bus didn't have air conditioning or the windows wouldn't open. And I got caught in there and I got sick and I was humiliated in front of all my peers. And at that point in time, phobias were done with first, worst, most recent. That was Francine's original model. Most of her models would start with a single incident that started it all, as we begin anyway. And so we just queued that up. And I didn't know anything about any variation of processing either. So we just jumped in and we started doing full processing. And in the intake interview, she hadn't reported anything remarkable in her past. She wanted only to work on this school bus issue. And as all of you on the call know, in unrestricted EMDR, you do a set of stimulation. I had instructed her to just let whatever happens, happen. And at the end of the first set, she started working through the chronological narrative of being on that bus. And I don't recall what a negative or positive cognitions were at that time. They weren't as strongly focused as the target itself, but probably had to do with powerless and maybe, I would guess, trapped, powerless, and probably shame or fear, anger would be something associated, all of which would seem quite appropriate. And so we started processing, and at the end, what are you noticing now? Well, I'm on the bus. Good, go with that. What are you noticing now? I'm starting to feel sick. Go with that. What are you noticing now? I'm starting to get really nauseous and I'm noticing all my colleagues are looking at me. Go with that. What are you noticing now? I'm feeling trapped and helpless. Go with that. And then, boom, a channel opened up. Okay. And what are you noticing now? My parents used to go out a lot. Well, in the standard EMDR, we thought, fine, go with that. Let's see where this goes. Interesting insight, we thought. And so, okay, go with that. Next set, we used to have a lot of babysitters. Next set, there was a babysitter I didn't like. The next set, I'm having visions of my bathroom, and bedroom. She very politely put her hand up and said, "Thank you very much, Roy. I have a wonderful understanding of my problems. I'll call you if I ever want to see you again." She didn't quite say it that way, but what had happened was this channel of being on the bus. Not only he went to a channel, but opened up something even larger and bigger, which had to be some early childhood, you could guesstimate some abusive scenario that she had not talked about, nor thought probably was connected to the issue on the bus. And we overshot our window relationship, and I couldn't repair it. And that was probably the first time that I started to emphasize, we've got to figure out this pathway. And how do you figure that out? And it's like we follow the cognition. Let's follow the cognition. So what would have been different, or if I were doing that client today, would have been that let's talk about number one, we might have had that same generic biopsychosocial. The client may not have disclosed anything differently. But I would have initially talked about, let's talk about how you feel on the bus. And let's identify your negative belief associated with that. And if it were around trapped and helpless, I might have pulled out any emotions associated with that. And then we would have started tracing that back. Any way you want to, you could do, just tell me other times you have felt trapped and helpless, or you've trapped. I might also set up now, how do you want to handle these things? I would want to make sure the positive is not, I'm powerful, but I can handle things even when I'm trapped and helpless, might have been what I needed to set up. But I would have walked her back through a direct question, or, you hear the term float back used. You could have said, think about the thought of powerless and float back to another time. I could have used scan back to another time. I could have used trace back. What we were looking for are correlations between this present scenario and where it could link up. And the cognition is probably the easiest way to go about that, and that is giving language to the emotions that come up. And we know that when emotions are activated, what we're bringing up is the emotions distort our perceptions of the event, and they create a perception we have, and that therefore we're putting language to that perception. And so we would have traced that back, and I would have asked, and I would always ask the family of origin, and this goes on getting past your past, is this really a present scenario, or is this a pre-existing condition? And I think that becomes one of the basic things that we ask routinely now. I'm going on the assumption that no matter how you explain this, how you perceive it, I want to see whether there's a linkage to this that is not about the incident, it's about the theme, the thought, the schema, the theme, the belief. And I think that's a really important piece for EMDR clinicians to understand that what we're really dealing with. So we would have talked about that. We would have talked about going back, and if I could have gotten down, I would have probed and questioned anything happened in childhood where you would have felt trapped, any bad things, any scenarios. And then if she would have said, yes, there is, then we could have talked about the relationship and what do we need to do to establish rapport and safety. Or if she says, yeah, I know it's there, but I don't want to give you details. That is one of the best things about EMDR is I don't need to know the details.
That's
Your brain knows it. I just need to know the resolution. So we would have worked on, well, probably even in those scenarios you don't want to talk about, you really want to feel like you did the best you could, even when you were powerless. You got through it. And so we would have established the second thought about it. And then we could have gone into deciding what to do with this. And we're going to talk later on today about this variable speed power drill that we use that I refer to as the processing continuum. And we know that standard EMDR is the most robust, aggressive process. And once the brain knows there's those connections, it might go there anyway. Now,
That's right.
a lot of clients have the ability to compartmentalize and they're not going to bring it up. But others, the brain is going to have more of a control and more power. It's going to start jumping to where it wants to go. And so the dilemma for EMDR clinicians who only have one power tool is, can I even do this?
Yeah.
And I think when we know that there's variable speed blenders now, the variable speed power tools, sometimes you don't even use a power tool. You come in with just a little hand tool and go very slowly. So there's a lot more assessing going on. But we would have been able to at least clean that off. And then if she said, I don't want to deal with that past event, we can put it in a container. We can do all sorts of exercises now that we know about that we didn't know back in the 1990s. And we could have done that work in a very safe way. And I think that also is so valuable for clinicians. I'm assuming almost all the people online that are having here have gotten over that anxiety about opening stuff up that was really too strong. But I think we lose a tremendous number of people starting EMDR training who are told, just go in and follow through this, open up, and see how it's too powerful for their existing clients. So I think that's also what we've evolved over the years is we've gotten to where much more complex clients are coming in and seeing the value of therapy that maybe they were ostracized from or they didn't have access to 20 years ago. So I think the populations we see, we still have the walking healthy that have those problems, but we have many more that are coming in that are having much more fragile internal systems. And so we've got to be much more careful about that opening up. And the days are gone by, wow, isn't that interesting, to whoa, that's terrifying. And it's terrifying not only for the client, but it's terrifying for the clinician.
Yes.
I think we all want to do no harm. We want to know how to manage the system. We want to stay one step ahead of the client. We want to prepare them if we know there's some things they have to work on.
Yeah, I remember being at a EMDR conference for the trainers, and it was kind of shocking that 70% of therapists that were trained in EMDR, I want to say before like 2013, 2014, when the processing continuum came out, they weren't using it because it was terrifying. We're in a business to heal our clients, not to hurt them. And that's why, I know that people are wanting to hear about the processing continuum. We're spending time building a foundation here. Like, where did this come from? Why have things changed? EMDR, Francine was an amazing forward thinker, and Roy was there for that journey with her. And so we're building up to the clients that we have today and why we're doing what we're doing and what has changed. I'd like to put out there that I think, Roy, a great transition from here, and you get to pick, would be the AIP and target sequence plan and how that evolved. But I'd like to check in with Andy to see if there's any questions coming through that we could work with. Are you okay with that, Roy?
Absolutely. I think this is really a three-way conversation. We want the people that are listening to have that. You see so many of these types of live webinars where all you're doing is listening, and we want to make sure we have ample time to get the third person in the room here, all 1,000 of you, having an opportunity to bring up with little things that we're doing.
Excellent. Andy, where are you?
I am right here. So our first question.
Well, let me pre-up that while you're looking for Andy. One of the obvious things, and the mouse in the room, so to speak, here, is what about all these Source for Mickey pictures? And this goes back to when I started doing individual workshops back in the 1995, 96, 97. Andrew Lee started doing resources works. And if you ever listen to Andrew Lee, he's a brilliant, beautiful clinician, quite committed to Francine and EMDR. But he's also he speaks professor speak. He speaks psychologist speak. No deference to professors or psychologists, but I sort of teach kid speak. I don't have the sophisticated mind to put all this together. So I remember sitting in one of his workshops and somebody coming up to me and saying, Roy, can you put this into something we understand? And so I started doing advanced workshops around resourcing first. And I at that time, my wife and I would go to Disney. We have a couple of children. We would go to Disney World. We lived in Cincinnati at the time. And so we were becoming regular visitors to Disney World. And I started to have a little Disney character that I would have, is sort of believing in the magic of EMDR and the resourcing. And then when I mentioned earlier, I was invited to be on this training team to become a trainer for the humanitarian program, and it was a rather challenging course. We had to take 6 different courses, or you had to do 6 different trainings in front of seasoned clinicians before you were ready to do individual training. And I moved through those very rapidly. Every month, one of them turned up. And I was in a position where I had the flexibility with work. My wife was our primary caregiver at the time, caregiver and primary family provider. So I could bounce off on these volunteer kind of free programs and do these exercises. And I had moved through almost all of the requirements by the time we had our conference, which at that time was in April. And at that time, Barbara Corzin was the executive director. And at that conference, she approached me and said, Roy, we have a training in the Middle East that but nobody will do. Would you be willing to do it? And I said, sure, I'll go. And it turned out that I led a team over to the Middle East. And it was an extremely challenging, kind of the best and the worst scenarios that happened one right after the other. And at the end of that, I'd taken a couple of little mementos I had, and I gave them out to all the people who was part of the team. And that led to me being the trainer for the humanitarian program for years. So I became the mentor of the other trainers who came up through the lines. And so it turned out that as we worked through that, they would get little Source for Mickeys when they graduated their training program. And then when I left the EMDR Institute in 2013 or 12, by then, if you've watched Fantasia, you know that Source for Mickey is this little apprentice and kind of put on the magic hat and like I'm wearing right now, if you can see the picture.
It is. You have it perfect.
Have it perfectly here. So in many respects, I saw myself as the sorcerer, with Francine being the sorcerer. I was the sorcerer's apprentice, and Francine being the sorcerer. And a lot of these pictures that you see on the wall represent different years and where I am, where I was emotionally, or where we were developmentally in the in EMDR Consulting in my organization. So I still do wear all the Mickeys, and we still give little source for Mickeys. I probably gave you one, didn't I? I hope I
Well,
did.
here's the thing. It's always right here, but my grandson was in for the baptism for my granddaughter, and Mickey is over there with all the other toys. And so, yes,
Okay. Well,
I
maybe I'll
do.
find. I'll hunt up another little source for Mickey sticker so you
Yep,
can.
yep, yep. Nope, he'll make it back when I clean up. So, I
So,
just have to give you a heads up. My lights are blinking. We have quite the storm here. So if I disappear, Andy's going to pop into my space. Andy, what kind of questions did you come up with?
yeah, so we got some good ones. Some will go better in other sections, but right now, the first one, the question was, I'm curious if you both have seen a shift in what's presenting to clinicians trauma-wise over the years, and if so, how has EMDR been shifting to meet the client's needs as well?
Excellent. And if I could put in a few words before we turn it over to Roy, that's why I'm here. When I got trained originally, when I was meeting with my clients, I'm like, there's a huge disconnect, right? And so when I learned Roy's processing continuum, belief focused target sequence plan, that was the answer. That's what filled the gap. In fact, we have a training that Roy has requested called Bridging the Gap. And that's what's going to be presented at the EMDR conference in August. And so we absolutely have noticed that there's been a shift in the type of client that's coming into our session and what they need. And so I'll let Roy take it from there. But I just, from my perspective, that is why I'm doing the work that I'm doing and promoting the basic training that Roy has afforded us, because it does speak to the gap there. Yes, Roy.
Yeah, well, I think, if you go back to the 1990s, post-traumatic stress disorder suddenly came to the mainstream. And it had a lot to do, in the United States at least, with a lot of veterans coming back from the Vietnam War, as we refer to it, or the American War, as the Vietnamese refer to it. And I think it became a thing in the mainstream, and that's where EMDR had probably put its shelf. And then probably evolution-wise, we now have evidence-based therapy, and now we have trauma-informed therapy. And quite honestly, I think it's the best and the worst of the same world. I think it's nice that we have become aware of it, and it also is problematic. And what I mean by that is EMDR, from the EMDR perspective, almost all the literature, almost all the marketing you see is about post-traumatic stress. All
Mm-hmm.
the clients you see have post-traumatic stress. And we have gotten ourselves cubbied holed down into this small little peg that we're supposed to try to fit into. And I actually did a little search a while back about there's only about 20 to 25% of the clients that are seeking psychotherapy have post-traumatic stress. And so what about the other 75%? And even to the extent that I've had in some of the trainings where I've conducted, I've had clinicians say, you mean we can treat something besides post-traumatic stress? I've had clinicians say my agencies won't allow me to use EMDR unless I diagnose my client with post-traumatic stress. So I think we're locking ourselves down. I think the second part of that whole dilemma is trauma-based EMDR. Now everything's trauma. Everything's trauma. Everybody's been traumatized. And you ask a lot of clients, they'll say, I've never been traumatized. I was never beaten. I was never abused. I was never starved to death, because the word trauma has the most significant connotation. Years back, we used to use the term big T and little t, meaning the big T traumas were the big things, the real kind of traumatic aspects, and the small t were those developmental glitches. And I think that's where Van der Kolk, I think, was one of the biggest proponents about pushing
Um,
for. You're still there. You're fading out.
I'm fighting it here. Keep
Yeah.
going.
But Van der Kolk was one of the best proponents of trying to get the adverse life experiences into the DSM, because there are so many things that have an influence on that. And now, if you think that link that with neural networking that we now know about, we know that the implicit memory system is in place at birth, if not earlier. And the implicit memory system is the one that's encoding all the feelings and the emotions that are happening. And so, you can think about the fact that neurologically, a parental criticism to an infant can be hugely emotionally activating, but that child learns to modify and adapt, and they grow out of that family system, maybe with a well-established "I'm worthless" or "I'm not good enough," or to be valuable, I have to be involving myself with all my siblings because I'm being parentified, but it feels good to do that. And so all those things are altering our lives' perspectives. They're altering our abilities to have, free choice and control over environments. But the client's not going to say that they're traumatic. So I wish we would have gone to a developmentally informed approach, or a developmental trauma informed therapy, because we know the past is present, and we know developmentally that the encoding that you have as a child has a huge emotional impact on you. And you either learn to live with it and modify and adapt it, and it becomes problems later on, the past being present, or you work through it and you have, through another arena, you found a different attachment style. But I think you want to look at that. So I think that they'll use trauma informed. Again, it to me is often more restrictive and limiting to our clients' perceptions, as well as to the therapist. Now, having said that, again, we know all this past emotional encoding is there, and it has a strong influence on who we are and how we perceive ourselves. And I think that's why, if you're not familiar with the still face experiments that were done back in the 50s and the 60s, look up the Tronic still face video, TRONIC, and it shows a mother going flatline with a little 1-year-old baby, and that baby totally dysregulates within moments. And that's going to have a huge amygdala encoding on that baby's neural network system. It was repaired in the video, and that would help teach attachment and separation, and a healthy kind of individualization component. But if it weren't repaired, then I've got this encoding of these strong emotional messages that are now starting to push me into a finer and finer kind of a compartment of maybe being afraid of showing my emotions, maybe being terrified of separation. And so those can be emotionally shocking to the neural network system, and they may or may not be attributed to a trauma, so to speak. So I think as clinicians, we want to be aware neurologically, and the past is present. And I think our AIP model, Paula mentioned, the AIP, adaptive information processing, to me is one of the probably best contributions Francine gave to the field of psychotherapy. That the AIP is sort of a way that very simply state that our past experiences, how they're encoding, good and bad, are influencing our present behaviors and our perceptions and our attitudes. And we all have positive things we really feel good about that give us courage and confidence to try new things, or to try do other aspects, because we have a background of success and having overcome challenges in a way that's positive. And we also, the flip side, have those negative things that tend to skew our perceptions and create limits to how we perceive our capabilities to be. So I think all of those things fit in to the AIP model. And so, when people ask me, or, if they would ask the clinician, how often, when your client walks into the door, under what lens are you watching your client from? And I'm going to suggest I see the client and I teach we should be seeing all of our clients from this adaptive information processing paradigm, and not necessarily from an EMDR perspective. I'm not one that says everybody gets EMDR from me. And we'll talk about this a little later on, that EMDR is one of many tools we as clinicians use, but the AIP model of understanding what's happening now and why is it happening, and the more strongly it's happening now, the more entrenched you are now, probably suggest an earlier and earlier encoding of those experiences that were never had the opportunity to be updated or corrected. So I know I think we lost Paula because of the storm,
We
and so
did.
going to
So,
jump in.
I'm here over here.
oh,
Okay.
Paula's back.
I popped in somewhere else. You know, you love technology.
Nice part is any finishing thoughts. We have 2 minutes before our first break. I will figure out a moment I can hear her. There
Can
we
you
go.
hear me?
Yes, we can hear
Okay.
you, and I'm adding
Yeah,
you back.
I can see you up. You're up there online. I can see you. I can see you just haven't found which one to focus you
Yeah,
on.
my other computer went out. Yeah, yeah. Okay. Yeah, no, it all sounds good. I just want to speak to when I start consultations. I do a lot of consultations with new therapists that are just getting trained, and I really hone in on the fact that our basic training is called integrating EMDR into your clinical practice. And I just came in on the end of what Roy was saying, but it's you learn it and then you integrate it because everybody's got different populations they're working with, depending if they're with an agency, a private practice, a higher level of care, IOP, school social workers. We've got social workers all over the place, or other counselors, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, it's finding what works for your client and the work that you do. And that's kind of where EMDR has evolved into.
Yeah, and if I can add one last little thought about the integration, I think when we saw a client with a single incident trauma, that's like you calling your doctor and saying, I have a headache, and they say, here, take an aspirin and call me in the morning. And
Yeah.
I think what we found now, there are very few people coming to doctors saying, all I have is a single situation. And so if you're working with a psychiatrist or a physical doctor, they're going to give you a cocktail of mixing and matching things. And I think one of the important things we'll talk about after the break is kind of the evolution of EMDR from a standalone single event to how you integrate it in as one of many treatment modalities, just as Prozac isn't the magic bullet for some psychological issues, EMDR isn't the magic bullet for these either. And so a lot of what we're talking about integrating is how to mix and match and use your own skill sets and how to use EMDR in sequentially aspects or other aspects of it as well. So great first period of time went beautifully, and maybe we'll start up with some questions after the break.
Perfect. Yeah, we got to jump. Mr. Max has determined it is time for break and potty. So
Oh man,
we will be back in at top of the hour.
top of the hour. Okay, Andy, thank you. I'm going to go see if I can get my other computer back up and running.
So we're just wrapping up our poll while Paula gets her internet back up post-storm. The question was, what's the biggest driver behind more complex trauma presentations in your caseload? So about 160 of you responded. So the biggest answer was we're better at recognizing and diagnosing complexity, so CPTSD and dissociation, followed by clients are more complex, so compounding stressors, later life crises, referral pipeline shifting, and then pandemic era collective trauma. So that's a pretty cool
Wait, how did
result.
that pandemic? I personally feel that the pandemic had a lot to do with the amount of dissociation that we're seeing. But it looks like I'm in the minority, so that's okay.
Well, and I think part from the EMDR perspective, and even just the awareness. You think about now social media, the media itself, stories, movies. I think they talk about Oprah Winfrey talking about it, one of the royalties talking about EMDR. I think that there's been more of an awareness of issues that are being put out there in shows and movies, and so I think
Miley Cyrus is a big one.
yeah. Yeah. So you start to sense that, wow, people are becoming more aware of it. And I think with regards to that, there starts to be more of an acceptance that these things are neurologically driven. I think the emphasis that we would, from our AIP model, say that these are not, I'm not defective, I'm not flawed, it's my brain, how my brain has put things together from Dan Siegel's work. So I think there's more of an awareness that is making it more acceptable for people to come and say, wow, I have these issues, I hadn't had them. Maybe it's not me being weak at all. Maybe there's some other aspect of it. So I think just the overall awareness of clients recognizing that they have these things and it's being okay.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's empowering the client, right? I know in my social media that I'm actually usually shocked at how many people that follow my content that are the clients, not just the therapists. So they're learning and understanding and knowing what they're looking for. So absolutely. Um, okay. So, Andy, where are we now? Did we lose Andy?
Yeah.
Helps when I
Okay.
unmute. I'm here.
Oh, there you are.
Sorry. We are moving into part 2, which will be your modifications. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. Nope, I lied. It's integrating EMDR into complex treatment plans. So yes, modifications. Haha.
No. Or segment 2, if we're doing a okay. We'll be working on how to do that. So I think when we talked about in our break was uh, to summarize, we really base a lot of what we're looking at on adaptive information processing. And that's a neurological term that just says our brain has this innate developmental movement towards healing and surviving within the environment as it knows itself to be true. And I think that's an important piece when we start looking at clients coming in the door and they come up with certain psychological presentations. They probably learned them at a time when it was necessary to learn them that way. So we talk a lot about attachment, attunement. You have the client who doesn't feel, or the client who's emotionally enmeshed, or has to be in control. They were probably taught that or learned that in the environment growing up. I have a severely anxiety parent, and therefore I better not show any emotions at all. I better shut those down. So our adaptive system is always trying to work on the environment it's in. And now they come in and now they're tangential, they're avoidant, they project. They those are all learned from our information model. They're all learned skill sets that the person hasn't been able to outgrow for whatever reason, or they're emotionally stored at a different frequency, so to speak, than what our adaptive system is. And I think you talked about these triangles that I use, but when I started mapping out the neurological origins, it seems to me that the most impactful criticisms we get are those when we're children. We're very vulnerable, we're very susceptible to our parental messages. And so when a parent says you're bad, I remember somebody saying for every one parental you're bad, that parent has to give you tens you're fine. And there's no parent that can keep up a 10-to-1 ratio with a child, let alone more than one child. So we all leave with these nicks and wounds that we have to overcome. And many of us do by getting in. And so the negative neural network has its broadest base at the level where most of these developmental issues, particularly, are most heavily encoded. So that's why the base is the thickest, where the emotional encoding is. And then subsequent to that, we have Hebb's axiom that is neurons that have fired together wire together. And so we know that the first time this happens, that my parent calls me stupid or they walk away from me and I feel vulnerable or inadequate. The next time it happens, I link to the first and I now start to create a whole schema or perception of self built over time. I get very, very good at being not good enough. And so that's sort of the ongoing growth, and it lasts across our lifespan. And so when you think about EMDR and Shapiro's three-pronged protocol, means we got to take care of the origins at some point in time. We got to take care of present triggers. And most importantly, we got to take care of those things that happen in the future. You think about the amygdala's fire alarming system is designed to protect us from future potential similar events. So all the weight of these negatives are designed to catch me and prepare me the next time I would feel vulnerable or worthless or inadequate. So we have that neural network that way, and that's how the pyramid is designed to be that negative neural network system that's probably functioning in an isolated form than in a frozen form. I think to kind of expand that one topic, when Shapiro originally looked at memories, they were frozen as in post-traumatic stress. And post-traumatic stress is the amygdala is locked the system down. It's not updating. The adaptive system isn't functioning. It's frozen at that moment of trauma, and then it just gets reactivated the next time something comes up. Whereas if you have what I refer to as an isolated neural network, then that system is one that's constantly modifying, adapting as I adjust across my lifespan. And so those are a little different. We all have isolated neural networks. Um, you know, challenging clients have frozen memory networks in the presence of a reasonably healthy adaptive network. The most complex clients have significantly highly charged negative isolated neural networks in the presence of frozen memories too. Now the other diagram is to invert the pyramid this way, um, to where, to me, we grow developmentally to have a positive sense of self. We don't grow up immediately having strong self-esteem as a 5-year-old that can be strong enough to handle something that we're dealing with when we're 25. So what's the gap? We've learned to grow and modify and expand our sense of self-actualization, our senses of awareness. And so that's why the negative neural network is more of an inverted V or V that grows out, whereas the negative is an inverted V that starts with the most highly encoded early, whereas you're growing with the positive. So we want to look at that. And from that AIP model, we want to look at how the client is presenting their issues and how to distill that. And I mentioned in the first part of the segment, one of the biggest challenges has been dealing with case formalization. How do I figure out what's going on? I'm going to go on the assumption that the past is present. I'm going on the assumption that once we start EMDR, especially, we have the capability of opening up anything in that neural network. And as a clinician, I want to feel comfortable knowing what's reasonably there so that I don't have these huge surprises. And so how do we go about doing that? Well, I mentioned the earliest kind of illustration I had with the woman who had a bus phobia. If we take it on a symptom-focused approach, you can say, why are you here? Well, I get anxious doing EMDR, let's say. Well, what is it that you're concerned about in doing EMDR? I won't do it correctly. I'll be a failure. And then you figure out what's failing me at doing EMDR. Well, I won't do the procedures correctly. That's a performance issue. What about, well, if I make a mistake, my client will think I'm inadequate or stupid and they'll fire me. Well, now that's a little different. That's a relationship issue. Or they might say, I'm afraid I'll do something wrong that will hurt my client. Well, that's a responsibility theme. All three of those are different and they show up differently developmentally. I think if you look at Erickson's developmental stages, our core beliefs can fit into those developmental stages. So it's important for us to figure that out from a symptom-oriented way. That's one of the easiest ways to go about doing that. But let's say you have other approaches. I mentioned earlier, Shapiro has these list 10 things that are problematic. And that's a standard that many people learn in how to implement EMDR. And while it has value, it has some shortcomings to it. You know, Shapiro said, wouldn't it be nice if we took care of these 10 things that bothered us from a target-specific perspective? But if it looks at it from a neurological perspective and a symptom-focused perspective, sometimes that strategy falls short. First of which you can have, and I've had people on calls come up with saying, I've done 6 of my 10 targets and the client isn't seeing any symptom change. Well, when you explore what those targets were, they weren't in the domain that was consistent with the symptom. So we were working on ancillary unassociated events. The second concern, however, comes more around the unexpected. And Shapiro would say, if you write these 10 things down, and the first one is the ideal where you starting from the past, moving forward. But if that first one has too high of a disturbance, and the client isn't ready for that, then pick one further up the chronological list that has a lower disturbance. Sometimes the problem with that is the first one and the sixth one are related neurologically. And then suddenly I think I'm working on a set of a two or three, and now I'm back down in a rabbit hole of back because there was a neurological linkage. So in the template around a core belief and a neurological mapping perspective is to always see whether there's a connection. So if you had that strategy of 10 things that you were writing down, if you had that strategy, then after you write the 10 down, you would try to see which ones are all relating neurologically around the same emotion or sensation, which one would relate to the same belief. And you end up taking these 10 and maybe distilling them down into three different categories that are all each category has its own neurological linkage. And so that is a way to take the commonly known 10 and distill it down so that you don't have the surprise of thinking you're working in one domain or one target and jumping to the other. And so that really is a significant change between the target specific and a neurological specific. The same holds true if you have more than one event. You can have several different neural network paths, and then you would prioritize which one of those networks would you do first. One that's similar that is equally concerning, though, is when they seem to have the same problem happening over and over again. A simple example, you might have a client who comes in who's been in 3 automobile accidents. The temptation would be to do the first, the worst, and the most recent automobile accident. And the shortcoming of that is, are they all in the same perceived domain? So if they all were I was responsible, then you have 3 events that are all the same of being it's my fault or I was responsible. You still want to look for, is that origin only with automobile accidents, or does it go back to a family of origin issue where I felt responsible? You would still want to do that. Well, always ruling out whether this is pre-existing. However, you could have 3 accidents that all represent something, have a different perception. The first one, maybe I was responsible for doing that. But the second one, maybe it was my fault, which is different than I'm responsible. First, maybe I felt responsible because I upset my children. They were in the back of the car and they got scared. Well, that's one domain around taking care of others' responsibility. But maybe I did something wrong. It was my fault. I turned when I threw a light. I missed the light. Well, is there some theme about that that goes somewhere else? The third, maybe I was in an accident that I was trapped in the car for a while and I couldn't get out. Is there a theme about being trapped and helpless that goes somewhere else? So we're always looking for these ways to make those connections. And then, one of the things we want to talk about in this segment is, what do you do with that? And so I mentioned earlier, once you have these outline and you have this map, however you put it together, you sit with your client and you go through this informed consent. Do you want to have all of the neural network come up and do everything that's associated with it? If that's the case, standard EMDR is the ideal. But if they say, I don't want to do that, I only want to work on some part of it, now you have to parcel out part of a neural network, take it offline, and then contain that part, and then work on processing the area that only stays specific to a particular event. And couple that with the fact you have a complex client who now suddenly gets dysregulated, and you're worried about the compartmentalization, they're worried about dissociation, you're worried about a complex layer. Now you can't have to even be more restrictive about how you implement processing. And so that is opening up the processing continuum. So before we jump into that thoroughly, Paula, any other question to that, or Andy, anything that's come up just in how we take AIP and case formalization depending upon how the client's presenting a concern?
hopefully you can hear me okay, because I'm having a heck of a time over here. And hopefully I'm appropriate every time my electricity goes out, that I'm not swearing or anything. Well, one of the things I want to point out is that even Stephen Porges,
We hear
with
you fine. Your video is free.
okay. So even Stephen Porges points out that our work is around pattern recognition. And we also reference the 20/80 rule. 20% is about today and 80% goes from the past. And then putting in the adaptive information processing model, what you're saying is basically telling the same story. We're always looking for what is it that's encoded from then that is affecting now. And so, yeah, it's beautiful. And then, Andy, any
Yeah,
questions
and
that
then
can be
adding
answered
that,
here?
and when you,
Yes, give me 1 second. I was just grabbing a different one. The first one
Stanley.
was,
Okay.
what do you do with a client who uses
Oh.
EMDR to avoid the trauma itself and instead
Okay.
fixates on an unhealthy obsession they won't let go of? It seems to help them self-regulate when the trauma came up, but it also reinforced the obsession is now causing other problems.
so you're breaking up too.
Andy, can you repeat that one more time? I
The
think our
questions
internet
here.
is, yeah.
Yep. It says, what do you do with a
Well,
client?
I think
Go ahead. What do you do with the client?
Do with a client who uses EMDR to avoid the trauma itself and instead fixates on an unhealthy obsession they won't let go of. It seems to help them self-regulate when the trauma came up, but it also reinforced the obsession and is now causing other problems.
Mhm. Were you able to get that, Roy?
okay.
Okay. Well, I'm going to jump in there and just,
Well,
or unless we can hear Roy, but I'm not hearing him right now. Roy, one more time.
I'm not speaking, but go ahead.
Okay, go ahead. Nope, I can hear you now.
Okay. Well, if I understood the question correctly, you have a client who and somehow uses EMDR that actually facilitates more. Well, I think first backing up to how they regulate, this Paula brought up polyvagal, knowing how we have to work with clients that way. But how, when somebody uses EMDR and it's not working, the very first thing I'm going to look at is to cycle back. Are you hearing me still?
Yep.
Yeah, we can hear you. I just turned off your video because I think it's lagging a little, just to see if
Okay,
it'll help
yeah.
with the audio.
That's fine. I think you want to look at the beliefs that a client is using, and are they adaptive and is it working or not working because of that? Sometimes a client doesn't move through EMDR because it's blocking, and the blocking has to do with a mismatch of a belief system. So, an example might be that if you pick somebody who is in a powerless setting and they pick as the desired outcome, I want to feel powerful, it has to be congruent with the scenario. If I were being hurt, or even if I'm in a car accident and I can't move, I am not anything but powerful. If I am an abuse survivor from childhood trauma, I'm not powerful. So the brain can't reconcile that. Now, the second part of that question I heard, though, is they're using it to open up and the reluctant or resistant to let go of something. I'm almost thinking, is that an addiction? And now we're into a system where I'm using this problem. I'm ruminating over this problem because it's taking my mind off of some other problem that is even more important. So now I'm addicted to that cycle. A third can be a secondary gain of I'm now defined by this diagnosis. So if I get PTSD, I now have benefits, I now have a community, I now have a definition of self because I am a PTSD survivor or I'm an XYZ survivor. And if processing wants to move that, then I run into a resistance because it's moving me into an arena I'm not prepared to move. I think especially in situations where you have long-term clients and now they start getting well, are you going to let go of them? Are they going to lose their once a week rent-a-friend that they can have? So I think there are all sorts of layers where you look at why isn't this working? And generally, to me, it's either because there's a mismatch of the belief system, or the second part could be you've exposed a deeper belief system that will prevent EMDR from working. And one of the common ones, we know EMDR processing generates a lot of feelings and emotions, and that's part of what we process are those feelings. And if I'm terrified of feeling and now an emotion starts coming up, I might potentially shut it down and lock it down because the real the core belief is it's not safe for me to feel, and I can't overcome that until you create an adaptive narrative that allows that to occur. And very simply, also, when you consider if you have the client who says it's not safe to feel, you really can't just accept it's safe to feel. That's too simplistic, especially on a developmental continuum, because I probably learned it wasn't safe to feel with a parent where it was not safe to feel. And therefore, if I say it's safe to feel, my brain can't reconcile that because it knows you cannot feel with this particular parent. But if you create, I can begin to learn when, how much, and with whom I can start to safely feel. That allows processing to reconcile that when you work with this one parent, you will not be able to feel. But when you work with the other parent, you can feel this much. When you have a grandparent, you can feel this much, and you start to learn how to do it. So I think when we run in the blocks, we really look at is this is the situation a mismatch, or is there a higher agenda going on, or is an addictive behavior to look at, and if with an addictive behavior, what are they focusing on, and if it weren't there, what would come up? So I think you have there's no simple answer to go through, but it's sort of a checklist of how do I go through these different things sequentially to see if there's one of them that really jumps out more heavily than another. And then we have to modify the approach that we're using, especially around the beliefs.
Yep. And in the basic training, Roy, I just have to put out there because it works so well. We use Jim Knipe's blocking belief worksheet, right? It gives like everything that you're mentioning right now. It gives us language. It helps new clinicians. You're going to hear somebody ask a question about parts at some point, but everything that you're mentioning shows up in some way, shape, or form on the blocking belief worksheet. And what is the remedy? To create a journey statement, like you said. I can learn when and how to. That will incorporate, both energies. So excellent question.
Yeah, and with Jim's blocking belief system, I'm not familiar with all the different questions, but you can add that one tab. What does it mean that it's not safe for you to tell people a problem?
Mm-hmm.
Or what
Yep.
does it mean if I'm overwhelming? Take it to away from the cognition. And one really quick thing about beliefs compared to cognitions. Well, what we're looking for is my perception of an event is a core belief, not a descriptor of me. And what I mean by that is, and I often say this when I train, you have somebody who comes in and they say, I have anger management issues. And you ask them, what is it about your anger management issue? And then you ask them, well, you, you can go with that. Let's see if I was asked to put my video up. It's still kind of blocking. So you ask them, what happened? Why do you have when you say you have anger management, what does that mean? You say, well, my partner and I had this agreement that I work outside the home, my partner works inside the home, and so they're responsible for the food, the meals, the house being straightened, taking care of the kids. And when I came home the other day after a really hard day at work, there were some of those things that hadn't been done. And so I started getting frustrated. I didn't do anything yet, but I started kind of getting frustrated. And then the children were running around, and I wanted just some quiet time, and they kept playing. And I kept telling them to go to another room, and they didn't. And then suddenly I exploded, and I yelled, and I screamed, and I threw their toys. So if that's the scenario and you ask the typical cognitive question, what does that say about you? They're going to say something that reflects they're reflecting on their anger. I'm out of control, I'm a bad parent. That is talking about what the symptom, the cause of that, they're talking about the behavioral response. What we want to look at is what caused you to explode. What was your perception when you came home that your partner didn't take care of the house as you thought they had agreed to do? Well, that could change to where I'm unimportant, I'm invisible, my needs don't matter, I'm being betrayed. Those could cause intense anger in childhood that I couldn't express as a child, but they would be there emotionally that can come out sideways as an adult. So that's a little subtle difference between the cognition. So I think sometimes some of those Jim Knipe blocking belief statements come across that can be just at that cognitive level. Ask that rhetorical question. Well, what's your perception if you couldn't do this in front of so and so? Well, what does it mean to you that you're not able to do that? That could distill it down to a more core belief, and that core belief could be traced back to probably childhood. And it seems to me that most of the core beliefs we have are implemented and ingrained in us before we get to kindergarten.
Mhm.
So those are all the messages we're picking up from our parents that are most influencing us are going to be those. I should write a book. Everything I believe about myself, I learned before I got to kindergarten. Sort of a parody about everything I learned about life I learned in kindergarten.
Perfect. Perfect. Mhm.
We did have another question. If you've gone through the 10 targets and the client continues to report symptoms, where do you go next? Do you revisit those memories again, even if the client reports a SUDS of 0? On the flip side, is 0 always required before moving into the next phase for clients who say they'll never get there?
So if you're going to go through the 10 targets, yeah. Well, I think there's two different questions. If you're using the 10 targets, if the 10 targets aren't clearing, I would step back and go to a more, let's focus on your symptom right now and what's it mean to you. So I'm going to shift over to a belief focused one and the symptom. And I would expect change to occur fairly, at least some movement and change to occur to start as soon as you start processing one. Now, having said that, the other part about integrating EMDR into your practice is that EMDR isn't going to teach you the new behavioral skills you need to change. It only allows you to be receptive to starting to learn those. So this is where maybe I have to shift from an EMDR desensitization model to one where I removed the barriers that have kept you from feeling you deserve to change or feeling worthwhile, but it doesn't mean that you know how to do it. So it's not that the target's processing didn't work, it is that they're now ready to learn how to make it work. And that's the integration part. So often, I think what happens is that you do some processing and now they're ready to learn how to date. They're ready to start to be able to push their envelope, but they don't know how to do it. And EMDR isn't going to make that happen. This is where you use other forms of therapy to help integrate. So I think it's looking at those aspects of it. But the original question, as I understood it, if I would probably after the third target, personally, if I had 10 of them after the third target, if it's not working, I'm going to discard that modality and really focus on what is it we're looking for change wise and shift from the 10 to one that tries to be more global in its targeting, sequencing, planning process.
Paula just lost power, so she is trying to come back on. So while we wait for that,
Okay.
we have one more question. One person wrote that they've tried calm place, meditation, hypnosis, polyvagal work, everything, and the client still keeps returning to the problem of the day instead of processing. What's your go-to to bring someone back into the EMDR focus when nothing else has worked?
So I think there's a couple of things to look at. You've tried to introduce calming strategies that cause a person to relax and to not be as hypervigilant. And you've said that this person keeps coming back to the crisis of the day which implies that they're trying to be vigilant. So, in my opinion, what you might be looking at is number one, a person who feels the environment is vulnerable. They're vulnerable in that environment. And so, trying those exercises is really going against the grain that might have a history of having a need to be quite crisis oriented. I think what you could do is, and Paula can send you this, we have a script called Securing Your Space, which is allowing you to be more mindful of how secure or insecure you happen to be in any given environment. And in that case, if the person is perceiving they're always insecure, you want to try to help them recognize some degree of control they could exercise to accomplish some degree of security. And so, it very simply, you just ask them on a 1 to 5 scale, how secure are you? And they might say a 2 or 1. Congratulate them on how secure that is. How are they doing that? How have they been able to evaluate the environment to know appropriately that they're at a 1? Or you can point out, well, you're in my office now, but you only feel a 1 secure. What else can we do here to help you be secure? So it seems to me that the core belief that this client is presenting is around insecurity, vulnerability. Calm places will not work because you're asking them to lower their vigilance, and that's terrifying them. Doing containers, doing more mindfulness exercises, environmental scans to recognize the appropriate degree would be appropriate. And historically, you want to look at times that led them to not be able to trust their environment. I think you have a lot of abuse survivors who trusted the adult to protect them and only to be hurt by them. They're not going to let their guard down, nor probably should they if they don't know how to evaluate relationships. Having said that, that could be a time where you could use self in treatment. How secure do you feel with me? And if they give you a little higher number than what they normally would give in any other situation, ask them how they've gone about evaluating that you're safer than what most places are. And now, how can you learn those skills? How do you learn to evaluate questions and answers? How did you test out my ability to protect you, or do you feel safe here? And then learn those skills, and then can we transfer those into other areas?
Yep. Okay, so Paula looks like she just came back.
I'm sorry, you guys. This is quite the storm. So, yep. So just keep going, Andy, because
yep. So we have another question. Any recommendations around adjusting EMDR work with ADHD clients? Direct fit. Is this a modification? Question is written. Oh, sorry. That was my note to myself. So any recommendations for adjusting work with ADHD, so that autism and ADHD combo?
Well, in my opinion, it's going to be somewhat basic. I think the first step is know how to work with that population. How do you normally do things? Now, how can you titrate down the procedures that we use in EMDR to fit what that client's capable of doing? So that could be in target acquisition. It could be more experiential activities, the more psychomotor activities pared down to more specific targets. All of those, because I'm one of those that have never worked with them. So I would say figure that out. Or get consultation with somebody who has to maybe help them bridge that gap. So maybe Paula has some more information that she could add with that.
I think Paula just froze, unfortunately. Yep.
Okay.
I know we've worked with Christine Molina. She's out of Texas. We did some of that with Farnsworth, and she actually did an EMDR and subtle adult autism training that if you check complextraumainc.com, that's Farnsworth's site, there might be another training in the future. That was a pretty good one. So with Paula's absence, this other one is, do isolated neural networks correlate with disintegrated parts?
So do isolated networks talk with, I don't know if I would say that they go with this, they could go with any part that has been unable to integrate up. So when you're talking about parts work, is it just another terminology for looking at a belief system? And so, and then when you see it, how entrenched is that particular part could illustrate how entrenched the belief system needed to be. So I think a lot of times the terminology you're using is to try to get the language that resonates with you so you can conceptualize your issue, as well as how you want to phrase these things with a client. And so you could look at that and what would the language be and how would you interpret it? I think an isolated neural network to me is one where I've had to learn to modify and adapt my behavior in a closed system. Simplistically, I often refer to the movie Groundhog Day as an illustration of an isolated neural network system where Bill Murray was stuck living the same day over and over again. His adaptive system was continuing to modify and adapt to try to work things through, and eventually it became quite functional. So that would be the isolation. Now, as far as what type of part persona that isolated network takes on, that to me is more of an illustration of how critical it was for me to have that persona, what I need to do. So you might have an interject, you might have what they call a protector. That means if I don't follow this certain rule or if I violate this rule, very bad things will happen to me. Then that particular perception is really well entrenched. Like it's not safe to feel. With a person who's totally shut down, you might have what you might term a protector who won't allow you to feel, because if you did, there'd be traumatic consequences. So if you want to use that terminology, you could use that to explain to your client why it's so hard for you to hold on to this particular perspective of yourself. And then it also strategizes you in parts work. If the person presents as that parts work presentation, you could even do EMDR between parts or with the host and the part that is kind of disintegrated or resistant or the protector. And there's a lot of, I think, internal family system strategies that lay the foundation for integration and dialogue and cooperation. I think that is something that's important when you're looking at parts perspectives. We're not trying to necessarily integrate as in absorbing and no longer maintaining that particular persona. It's more a matter of how do you work collaboratively to allow that system to recognize the appropriate degree of its involvement and also how it can integrate with other aspects that are more adaptive and more up to date based upon what I've learned in other arenas that don't have the same critical encoding.
So we are definitely seeing a large storm blow through Chicago. So we're hearing some in the chat about that. Paula has lost internet, so she's trying to call in on her phone. So we'll keep going with some Q&A, and then Roy, after this one, maybe you and I just have a chat. The next one is, how do you modify treatments for survivors of human trafficking who never feel safe and have no one close in their lives?
So I think, with these very specific things, you can start by trying to find out how they've been able to reach out. So some of this is neural network building. And you think about neural networks, when you look about the simplest case, if I may, it's hard for you to see. If I hold my one arm up and I have the whole forearm starting from my elbow up to represent a positive neural network, that includes my forearm, my wrist, my hands, and my fingers. Let's say that's the positive neural network, that whole forearm. If I have a very simple case where I have a highly functional client, that client has that forearm full of life experiences. And their negative situations are represented by your pinky finger on your left arm. Those are the easiest ones to do because that pinky finger can easily be absorbed in neural network consolidation into my right arm forearm. It can be absorbed there. When you have like hand to hand, wrist to wrist only, this more balanced, more equal, it could still work. It might take a little longer time. There's more material that's moving, but it can still work decently. When you have the full forearm and hand and wrist and fingers all of a negative system, such as that person you described who's been trafficked, and you have what appears to be an anemic, invisible, hard to imagine pinky finger of positive resourcing, positive aspects of life, that is not going to be one that can be easily overcome by just saying go with that in any type of modality. So you have to pare back the processing. You also have to try to accentuate their positive. So you could try to pull out times when they have found some confidence, somewhere even in this horrible experience where they had somebody befriend them, somewhere where they were safe enough momentarily, and try to focus on some of the positive through resource strengthening perspective. Then you could, if it's over and you're done, you could try to build up. How can you do it now? How are you doing it even in this relationship? How can we begin to start building those scenarios? If that's still insufficient, then you might try to pull on an archetypal figure, an admiring figure they may have, um, and then see whether you can do that through projection. If you had this person you admire or a spiritual figure, how would they help you begin to start to do that? And so there's lots of variations. I think theoretically, I need you to kind of be able to start to see the positive. I think often with these types of clients as well, it's very terrifying to have any positive sense because it's been short-lived, maybe it's been punitively handled, and so they can begin to learn. And as Paula mentioned before she lost sight, these are journey type things. I can begin to learn. I can begin to consider someday maybe I'll work through this. I think you try to grab on to whatever they can positively hold on to, um, and try to build up through your relationship, through your securing their space types of exercises where they can begin to recognize degrees that they're experiencing now, and work on it from that perspective.
Okay, I think Paula may have called in. Paula, if you're out there, feel free to let us know. I see a phone in. They are muted now, though. But we did have a question that just popped up in the chat that lots of people, and the line was, Roy, help us out. So they have a client that talks excessively and expansively. When I ask her, what do you notice now? How do I get her to stay on track?
Okay, so the first thing you want to know is it pathological or is it psychologically necessary? So this goes back to where I'm interviewing you. What are you doing? How have you used conversation? How have you worked about talking? So if the person has shown a lack of validation, that they have some attachment repair issues, they've been invisible, they've been unwanted, you have a challenge because that client needs to have communication and connection as part of their healing. So in that case, if it's out of a psychological need, and you know that the long discussion in between sets is losing momentum, the first thing you could ask them to do is try to negotiate some processing time and then some talking time. And one ways I explain that is if we're trying to get somewhere and we get stopped at every traffic light for 30 seconds or a minute, we lose momentum. And if you stop and talk and for extensive periods of time, you lose the efficiency of the processing that is most effective under the influence of the stimulation. Would you be willing to do let's say 5 minutes, 5 sets where you just notice and go, tell me a brief comment and go, and process through that, and then a stop and talking, because I know that that's very important for you. So that's with a person who has the need in a healthy way to get attachment attunement. And you know that if you would negate it, you would be replicating possibly what happened earlier in their life. Now, if they're using it as an avoidance, now you have a different agenda. Where did you learn to talk and be tangential and talk so much? Is it a way to avoid and minimize your feelings? And I would have that discussion through some psychoeducation. And then I would point out, we're going to try to do this differently where I'm only going to limit you to point to something. I want to look to that. And then we'd have to set up, what does it mean that you can't communicate or you have to? And so it's not safe to feel. I could be using my excessive tangentiality and my intellectualizing to be it's not safe to feel. And I again would look at, where did this start? Where did you learn to be very chatty? What was it benefiting you, or what were you avoiding if you got really chatty? So you look back at the behavioral response, and is the past showing up in the present? Where did you learn to do this? This holds true with those who project, will intellectualize, deny, avoid. All of those could be perceived as learned behaviors. And so, if that's the case, then you're going to have to be challenging to take that away so that they can be authentic. So, it all depends on what you understand. And that begins when you're interviewing your client and you start to understand the dynamics and understanding really what the therapeutic relationship is accomplishing for that particular client at that particular time. So sometimes you need to be willing to listen. Other times you have to set boundaries. But I think the realize that transference is very alive and well in EMDR. You have to be very aware of what's being played out with the client, so as that you don't violate that trust in that relationship and fracture the relationship. So knowing the core belief allows you to make some clinical judgments and choices. Quick story, I have a moment. I had a young woman who that didn't feel she was being paid attention to. She was being dismissed by her boyfriend who was too interested in watching TV. We traced that back to a father uh, who would cut her off and not pay attention. And we set that up with a legitimate standard EMDR session. And at the end of the first set, she started doing what you just described with this client and started to talk a lot. And I tend to work pretty fast. I usually don't allow a lot of conversation, don't find a lot of conversation between sets to be effective. So I interrupted her at one moment and said, go with that. And what do you imagine happened? She yelled at me. She said, you're just like my boyfriend. You're just like my father. And now I have some attachment repair to do. And so if I had said, go with that, it would have destroyed the relationship. Instead, we stopped doing the eye movements altogether. And I said, tell me more about that. And started to be more actively listening, parroting, mirroring, all of those things we learn as talk therapists, until she said, okay, you can start. And then we repeated that 2 or 3 times, and it took that several 2 or 3 times of her talking as much as she wanted before she wanted to go. So in that case, it wasn't an avoidant. It was really necessary for her to set a boundary and to get her needs met. And she was able to do that through my error. And I was able to catch it and be corrected through doing that. So it all depends. That extra talking person can be something they need to have, and you want to make sure you facilitate that in a way that's still efficient for processing, or it's pathological, and then you have to kind of pull it back and interfere with it or disrupt it.
Awesome. So we have about 8 minutes left. So before we take a short break, if someone left today and changed just one thing about how they think about adapting EMDR for clients who don't fit the standard plan, what would you want that to be, or any overarching advice?
Yeah, I would want to give you two. One, think about the core belief and the neural networks of the past is present to understand what it is that they're humming. You're not working on single incident issues. You're working on a collage of events. So the neurons that fire together, wire together, and process together. So that's the first part. The second thing, and we'll spend most of our time in the third segment talking about the continuum. Standard EMDR, very briefly, when you want to control processing, you control that by what you do. And there's two things that facilitate what happens in processing. The longer you do sets of stimulation, the more it can happen. The more new insights, connections, channels, the more will happen. The less you say, the more will happen. So if you have a client who doesn't care where it goes, do a lot longer, don't say much. As soon as you start to have somebody who needs to kind of pull back, then shorten the duration of the stimulation and say more. So basically, that's the essence of what we'll talk about with the processing continuum, where EMDR is 20, 30 seconds or more of stimulation and that open-ended question, what do you notice now, which invites total free association. And that's what that does. The more contained EMD with a lowercase r means you want to minimize free association to stay on one arena event. So here I'll pull back on the stimulation. Let's say I'll do 15 to 20 seconds of stimulation, and I'll remind you of the automobile accident, or I'll remind you of whatever your issue is. And then I'll ask you, what do you notice? So that you still have an opportunity for insights and connections, but you're not having it across your lifespan. It's specific to a particular area or arena of the event. When we talk about very complex clients who could cascade into the abyss, you cannot afford very long stimulation because it will overactivate the neural network system and they'll go, into that Pandora box. You may only do 5, 10 seconds of stimulation, and you're very directive. So not only do you remind the client of the event, you want to also pull them out of their right brain, which is what occurs during processing of the stimulation. You want to pull them into their left brain. Your left brain is the logical linear part of your brain. And what question do you ask to get a logical linear answer? How much does it bother you right now? 0 to 10. So the essence of the processing continuum would be the most open-ended 50, 30, 25, 30 seconds. What do you notice? If I want to have you only contain processing to one event, when you notice the automobile, now take a breath. Now, when you notice the automobile accident, what do you notice? And if you want to restrict processing, now when you think of the automobile accident, how much did it bother you, 0 to 10? And those three are the ways to manage processing. They're also a way to manage affect. If I have a client who starts to exceed the window of tolerance, I can pull it back down by going from standard to restricted and then back to contained and slowly open it up again, very much as you would an accordion. So that is the essence in simplistic terms of the processing continuum, which to me also deals with the crisis of the week, the person who has to take care of one thing. And if you open it up, it'll open too much up. They want to stay only on the topics they're on right now for whatever the reason. You've got to be doing EMDs or fragmented EMDs. Paula works a lot with dissociative clients. You can't even pick the automobile accident. You have to pick getting in the car and then driving down the highway and then going through the traffic light and then the car screeching in front of you. And then you got to pare it down to smaller and smaller bites to manage their affect. So the continuum is that variable speed tool that allows you to manage the processing, just like a variable speed blender or a variable speed power tool. You speed up, slow down, depending upon what it is you need to have and how you want to accomplish it. So those are the two things I'd like to really remember if you have to leave. Don't think of things as just strictly target specific. Always ask the question, is this from the past? And you find that out by understanding the belief and tell me, have you experienced that belief, those feelings, those emotions, those perceptions of this situation before? And ask that. If you can't get that, or it's not appropriate to ask it, then I would not do standard EMDR. I am not going to go in with a client that I don't know historical roots to because it's not appropriate, or they're not able to give me that. And so you have highly complex clients, highly traumatized clients. The last thing they want to talk about is what happened to them when they were 5. They want to talk about what happened to them this morning on the way to the office, and you can give them relief by doing that. Very quickly, you can add one other thing since this is an advanced workshop. You can do what we've referred to as CID, which is just think of the incident, how much it disturbs you, and that eliminates the belief because the belief is what opens up the channels. And so you could teach them just CID. That also is a free app. Paul talks a lot about the WeMind organization through Moved, and they have a free app on the phone, WeMind CID. The last time I talked to them, we've gotten over 10,000 hits in the United States alone It's free for your phone on Apple, and it's under WeMind CID, and you can look on from the phone or Android or iPhone. Free. And by the way, when you do that, as a quick aside, I said earlier, the more you do, the more happens. The less you do, the less happens. The more you're focused on a logical response, the less happens. So the CID program, and it's a self-use program. And by the way, I receive no compensation for that at all. It's designed to only go 8 seconds of stimulation. And at the end of every set, it has you take a SUD and measure a SUD on a scale. And if you happen to report a SUD higher than the preceding one, it stops you. And that's critical for your complex clients. So you're trying to give them a quick little desensitizing app. You don't want them going very long, and you want them to give you a set at the end of every set because that'll shut down associated links.
Excellent.
Perfect. Well, perfect timing. Paula is back. So fortunately and unfortunately, she is back online. Unfortunately, I wanted a flying monkey from Oz, so keep safe.
We were
for
twirling
those.
there for a while.
Yeah, so everyone in the Chicagoland, please stay safe. We're going to go jump on a 10-minute break, and we'll see you at 10 after the hour.
Great.
Do you want to break out room, Paula?
Yes, please.
Part of what occurred to me is kind of cycling back to how do we even get here? Because we have this very strong influence of this model. You follow the rules, follow the structure, EMDR, do it right, rules, protocols. And I'm not one that says I don't like to use the word protocol. It implies you rigidly do the things. So I think one of the things that's important for us as clinicians to realize, regardless of the relationships we have, is we are bringing ourselves to the table. And we share what we have as our background, and we're sharing that as clinicians. We're sharing that with our clients. We're sharing that during processing through clinical interventions and how we perceive things and some of the dances that we set up. And I think probably I want to spend a moment about how did I do this? How did I put together the processing continuum and the beliefs? And to me, I think the reality is that we're mission oriented. We have this task to do, and the task is to provide the best treatment we can possible to our clients using all the skill sets we have. One of which it can be EMDR to a greater or lesser degree, or some component that we are attributing to EMDR. And so I think one of the messages I want all of you to leave, going back to that question before, is probably the most important thing to learn is trust your clinical intuition and trust your own judgment, regardless of what you're doing. And accomplish the task is the goal. It's not about the protocol or procedure that you use. And as I was taking my break, I kind of bounced back to probably my first exposure to protocols and procedures had to do when I was learning how to fly an airplane. And when I first learned how to fly, I memorized every step. We had protocols to taxi and protocols to take off and protocols to do an aileron roll and protocols to do a loop. And everything was driven by do this, do this, do this. Set the power settings, set the name of the bank, set all these things very robotically. And probably in my learning of how to fly, that was the modality that was the primary focus for about the first 100 hours of flying. And then by that 100th hour, I had flown a prop airplane. I'd been flying a jet aircraft by then. I was flying in formation. We were doing acrobatics. We were doing a lot of different things. We had learned a lot in those first 100 hours. And then we got into a very, very complex flying pattern where we were practicing air-to-air gunnery. I was trained by the Navy, and we tried to do a little bit of everything, which is basically the foundation of our training based upon that learning experience, where we train you to be a little bit of everything, a family physician. But in that particular illustration, we had a very, very complex flight pattern where we were flying past a tow plane at about 250 knots, sharply pulling off of that aircraft climbing to a starting point, which we've called the perch. And if you got to the perch in the right time in the right sequence, you would be in sequence with another three airplanes, who all of which were doing the same things in a very complex flight pattern. We would be fully diving into a banner and shooting bullets at a banner. And if you were in the right spot, everything worked fine. If you were out of sequence, you could either be shot at or shooting at somebody else. And I still remember this instructor teaching us that, all of us newly, aviators, and one pilot saying, "Well, what protocol do I use to get to the perch, and what angle of bank, and what power setting do I use?" And the instructor said, "You're pilots now. Put the airplane where it needs to be. I don't care how you do it. Put the airplane where it needs to be." And I think the message that I'm trying to get across is, if you've grown to the point where you know EMDR, you know intuitively the processes, put the client where they need to be. Do what the client needs to do. And so that might not pass the fidelity checklist we have to put up with, but it's not doing research. We're doing therapy. And so this is where we're going to be talking about all these nuances that some would say isn't EMDR at all. Some would saying you're breaking all the rules. And that's okay. I'm sure Paula has the same conversations I've had with consultees who have said, "Oh, I'm afraid I did everything wrong. I stopped and I talked, or I did this and I did that, and I broke the EMDR rule." And if I'm sure she'd ask the same question that I would ask is, "How did it work out?" And then the client says, "It worked great." And then we say, "Well, then you did the right thing clinically." And I think this is really an important piece. And is where we lose a lot of clients. We lose not clients, we lose a lot of therapists, because we are not working with square pegs. We're working with complex individuals that have all these nuances. And the original model that Shapiro put together was for a simple client. It was a square peg. All you do is put a square peg in a square hole, and it worked. Now we have, all sorts of things that need to be put in there. And EMDR, or part of EMDR, can be part of that process. So I know the emphasis was on, what do you do with a client who walks in crisis, or is overwhelmed, or only wants to work on the crisis of the day? Meet them where they are and do what it needs to be done to get that. Now, how do we take advantage of that? What is the real change agent in our process? It is not the protocols and procedures about EMDR. It is the stimulation. And this is where I love to talk about the distracting activity. Research has shown that distracting activity automatically lowers emotions and sensations, period. Irrespective of protocols and procedures of any other modality, whether it's EMDR, EMDR 2.0, whether it's all these other variations that you're getting. So the stimulation, the distracting activity, is the catalyst to do this. It also lowers emotions and sensations. So if I have a client who comes in totally dysregulated, I want to lower their emotions and sensations, period. And then go from there. You got to get them to that level. So how do we go about doing that? We can go about using CID. You just might be so upset. All I need to say is, what's upsetting you? How much it bothers you, 0 to 10? Follow my fingers. And within probably less than a minute, if you do an 8-second burst, that will lower things down to where now you can, let's talk about it. So you have that person who's walking in a crisis of the day, that's CID. That is not EMDR. We're not even allowed to mention it in our training, because we only can talk about basic EMDR stuff. And we're not supposed to teach people CID because it's not EMDR. Purposely, I fought for it to be that way. So that allows us to teach anybody and everybody CID, or the self-use. So if you have that person comes in totally furious about the fact that the person at the desk didn't say hi to them, or the person cut in front of them in the line while they were getting on the public transportation, you can say, particularly once they know that stimulation, they're used to that stimulation by the hand motion or rapid tapping or whatever it is, it's part of your therapy approach. Say, okay, how much it bother you? Good, go with that. And you do a real quick set. How much it bother you? You can knock that down. And oftentimes that is the first thing you want to accomplish in a really complex client when they come up dysregulated. You want to get them regulated enough to talk about the therapeutic goal. So that's the first thing you can do. And again, you can be doing it standing, sitting, self-tapping, whatever. Think about the instant, how much your body is 0 to 10, 8, 10 seconds stimulation, and then do it again until it drops and no longer drops as far as it can go. Now, secondly, with something that's really tightly held, you can get those crises because they're right on the surface. They're not metastasized in their neural network yet. You can get those probably down almost to a zero within less than a minute. And so it's a great thing to start off with your client who maybe is reluctant to use EMDR as in seeing that it will desensitize and work. Try that. And if they get relief from that, they might be interested for you to say, wow, you know, if you got a little bit out of this, let me show you what it really can do. The second thing is now you can use EMD if you want to call it that. EMD, technically, I might say, is in the arena where I have some sense of history. I've got another version of the restricted processing called ATIP, which doesn't talk about history either. This is essentially EMD. But you can queue up something, and when the client comes in and you know that they can't tolerate history, or they're at Maslow's hierarchy, they're at Maslow's baseline of just surviving, they're not ready for a self-actualization. They just got to get by the crisis of that day, then do the EMD with them. And those are usually 5 or 10 minute short interventions. And then you can do then you can do integration. Now, one of the things that we haven't talked about is that we know from our adaptive model, the past is present. And what that means is when I have a situation that happens now, I use as my baseline reference all the neurological history I had that brings it up to the surface. That's the emotion that happens now from which I decide how to perceive the event. That's going to change my attitude, which will dictate my behavior. So there's another strategy you can use to change the perception of the event. And that is that you can do a resource exercise. What skill do you need to have? Or now that you've gotten through that, what skill do you need to have to deal with that situation with the person out in the office? And now let's bring that up. Tell me when you have used it before, and then strengthen that through stimulation. Slow, soothing stimulation enhances positive things that you already have, and you can pull that out. Or you can tell me, pull up 3, 4, 5 of them if you need to create that momentum, and then go back and re-script what just happened 20 minutes ago. Re-script, had you had this resource, had you had this new persona, if you had gotten rid of that triggering moment and now you're in your more adaptive mind and you could access this, how could you have done that? And rewrite how that was under the stimulation of slow rhythmic tapping or walking through that allows you to have that sink in. And repeat that a couple of times so that they start to change the neural network's activation. Resourcing changes activation if you apply the rescript rehearse component. And when I developed the rescript, I said, go back to a time you just did this and change how you would have responded with the new information you have. So that's the first phase. And then now when you leave and you walk by that person at the front desk and they still do the same thing, how are you going to respond differently knowing what you just learned? And then strengthen that. And what we're doing, in my opinion, no research, is that we're changing your neural network. We know research has shown that you imagine something often enough with a positive affect associated with it is almost as good as doing it. And we know that through practicing shooting baskets and stuff. So creating that imagination of how it would be different is going to be a very powerful thing. And this is a wonderful thing with any new insightful piece of work you've done with your client, whatever they've learned, whether it's under the influence of an EMDR intervention or any other intervention. Do a really quick rescript rehearse at the end of the session, the last 10 minutes, 5 minutes. Take what you just learned today with this new insight. How could you apply it? And you'll know them well enough. How could you apply that with leaving home this morning? Or how could you apply it with your boss? Or how could you apply to sitting in the line for your food stamps? Whatever it is, to be able to do that. And then we script rehearse. So those are the really quick, short interventions with that very complex client. And the rhythm of the EMD, I mentioned very quickly as before, is the fact that it's done very rapidly. You don't give them time to think about it. You do a short 8-10 seconds max, and then tell them 0 to 10 and then go again. And you get that rapidly so fast that their brain doesn't have an opportunity to make other links. Okay. Do you have a question, Paula, or comment?
I do. I just wanted to politely interrupt. So one of the things that I really kind of struggle with is we don't spend enough time talking about like Bruce Eckert and memory reconsolidation, which is the whole key to phase 3 and the setup. And, you call it in your training, front loading resources. Can you just speak a little bit about that corrective experience and how you're strengthening and enhancing that positive neural network that then is going to make our link binder connecting go really a lot faster and a lot easier. It's almost like magnets. Do you mind speaking to that a little bit?
Andy, if you can create a quick poll,
Sure.
about which neural network is more important, the negative or the positive.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I learned it here.
Do a quick poll.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as you're doing that and putting that together, I think Bruce Eckert and I should say, how did I get here? Going back to how did I get here from the learning? Certainly, I learned from Yuri Bergman's The Neurological Foundations of EMDR. I've learned from Bruce Eckert and Tickig about the unlocking the emotional brain, Alan Shore, right brain psychotherapy, Dan Siegel with all his beliefs. And so I'm going to say that a lot of what I've done is put the puzzle together differently. And I'm happy to see that those of you will have gotten the hint that the direction in which we're heading is more important than where we've been. And so I'm happy to see that most of you, and quite honestly, I did this poll last year. Paul mentioned I presented a continuum, and the majority of the people in the EMDR community would say the negative. That's how we've all been trained and socialized to look at. But it really is the direction in which you're heading. And so, can they see it? Do they have it? Do they have that established? Makes processing much more quickly accomplished. If they don't, then either you've got to try to desensitize the noise enough that they can start to access it. This is one way to look at it. Go on the assumption that it's there and not that but the negative is blocking it and suppressing it out. And this is one way, when you think about phase 3 and what does the validity of the cognition mean? I go on the assumption that the positive system is there, but the negative system is masking and blocking it out. So a real simple illustration, when we start phase 3, we ask the person prior to that, I know in my head, if you know cognitive behavioral therapy as a cognitive behaviorist, the distortion is I know in my head that it's true. I know it's a 5 or 6 or 7, but when I bring up the negative, I don't feel that. And that's what Shapiro was trying to measure with the validity of cognition. So if you think about what we're trying to do when we set up the disturbing experience, you bring up we know you have a positive experience, and then I start phase 3 assessment. I've created noise that comes up, and that noise blocks out how much I can access what I know to be true. So when my arm was a full forearm, that's my 7. But now when I say, think about the negative experience and your negative thought, and you think about how true does the positive feel, I can only see a 2. And then when we process, these two things are happening simultaneously. And this is an important analogy to recognize. We're not doing one side and then the other side. We're doing them simultaneously. So if you think about Shapiro's original model, bring up this negative thing, and all you have is this big negative piece here. And then as you lower it, it gets away and it goes away. And then suddenly this positive thing is here. And that to me is no longer accurate. It's following that other modality. If this is here, I know it's here most of the time, and I pull this up, then as an interesting experience, and you maybe Paula can organize you to do this, try sometime when you're processing and you take a SUD, take a VOC at the same time. Take them both. And I would be curious. I would say, if I were doing research, my hypothesis would say, as the sun goes down, the VOC is going to go up.
Mm-hmm.
And so that changes a lot of things. Now, the problem is when you only got this much of a VOC, you got a real problem because you can't use this whole piece here. You're going to have to use just a really small little piece to work with a small piece. So it's a wonderful way to look at it as a metaphor to acknowledge. Okay.
Yep, and that's exactly where EMD comes in, right? Because as you're using EMD to just desensitize and shift visual imagery, then your positive belief cognition can engage with the prefrontal cortex. So from a neurobiological perspective, it all makes sense. So love that, Roy. Thank you.
Yeah, it slowly gets more and more. So this is where you front load EMDs, and over the course of time, there gets to be a tipping point. So my analogy of this really big, huge negative network and anemic positive, with each kind of intervention where I do a little bit, I build my positive just a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, and the negative starts to decrease a little bit. Eventually, you can start doing more and more. Now, one other thing with EMD, the question is always asked, because when we set EMD up, typically number one, if you're doing it with a history, you put the piece away that you don't want to work on. If you're doing it blind, you're going to say, stop me if anything else comes up. Either way, stop me if anything comes up that we have not agreed to focus on. So generally, the person walking in with a crisis of the day, frequently they don't make the neurological connections because their system has some degree of compartmentalization. However, very complicated clients are always in that state of negative activation. They probably could bring it up, but you're going to say only focus on walking past the front desk and not having the person say hi. That's all I want you to focus on. Stop me if it comes up. So what do you do if you stop? What do we do now? We have to follow my general guideline, which is the more I do, the more it comes up. The less I say, or the less I say, the more it comes up. So conversely, in EMD, I don't want to do very much and I want to say a lot. Okay? I don't want to do much stimulation and I want to say a lot. So let me say I have this internal clock that says I'm going to go 10, 12 seconds, and I'm not counting, but I'm watching my client. And I get a sense of that intuitive component. But let's say they stop me. And it sounded like that was about 2/3 of the way into what I typically do with this client. So how am I going to change that? Well, what happened when they gave me the stop signal? Number one, they couldn't hold it together under the influence of stimulation. No matter how they tried to stay here, boom, other things popped up. So I want to keep that from happening. So I do less. I might do only 5 seconds because you cannot, that person's internal system cannot hold it on task for that long a time. So I'll do 5 seconds. The second thing I might do is I'm going to be even more specific about the event. I'm not going to just say, think about think about what happened in the front office in the waiting room. Now I'm going to say, think about you walking by and saying hi, and that person at the desk didn't even look up. I'm going to be very specific. And then I'm going to immediately say 0 to 10, how much you do that to shrink it down. Okay. Now, another exercise, if this is too abstract, and some of your complex clients, thinking about it is too abstract, we have a strategy which we call Scribble It Out. And here you can have a piece of paper, very simply get a piece of paper, fold it twice, and then you've got to where you have 8 quadrants, 4 on each side, and then say in the first upper quadrant, draw the what happened in the front desk, or write the word that you thought about yourself that happened when you walked by the front desk. And then on the right side, draw a line from 0 to 10 and mark how much it bothers you. And then scribble that out for 8 seconds. Don't scribble out longer than that. Paula was the one actually that told me somebody over scribbled and it opened up too
Mhm.
much because the longer you go, the more can happen. And this holds true with scribbling it out. But if you have somebody who needs to be very concrete, you could say, we're going to do right that. Okay. And you're going to work on that. If you have somebody who's giving you a list of 10 events that are really problematic in the present, I might write those down on cue cards and put them all in an envelope and only pull out the one card we're going to work with today. Or you have a really traumatic event, we're going to write down on 5 or 10 cards each issue that was part of that chronological narrative. And then we're only going to work on one of those. The rest of them are going to be in my envelope or in my file folder. And then I might even make that a scribbling out exercise. So you can see how we work on paring it down, paring it down, paring it down, paring it down, paring it down to make it
Real quick,
tighter
Roy,
and
they've
tighter.
asked, what's this exercise called that you're referencing?
That's called Scribble It Out.
Okay, perfect. I'll
And
link
I'll
it.
send, I'll send you all I'll send you all a video of my scribbling it out that I did right after COVID, where I got overwhelmed with too many plates spinning. But it's in there. It's also if you've been trained by us, you can go to the website and get it scribbling out. If you're not in our methodology, you should be able to go there. If not, you can also go to vimeo.com/ EMDR Consulting, and that will give you a scribble it out exercise. It's really simple. I have a video of a 5-year-old doing it, terrified of wasps. It took her two rounds of scribbling it out, and it was done. Unfortunately, we adults have more sophisticated neural networks, and we're not quite as efficient as 5-year-olds are in that regard. So I know Paula wanted to talk about how do you do this with these people walking in, taking advantage of the distracting activity that goes with stimulation. I'm very careful about saying that's not necessarily even EMDR. In fact, the EMDR police would probably lock both Paul and I up right now if they saw. But we can do that in advanced training. We can talk about stuff that's beyond what Shapiro originally worked on. Okay. So, yeah, somebody's saying they're seeing how it works with kids. Absolutely. It was kind of an outgrowth of Ignacio and Lucinia down in South America with the butterfly hug that goes back to the 90s when they did the
Mhm.
butterfly. This is a more truncated version of that.
Well, and it also came from Foursquare. I have to put that out there because Foursquare was part of the training for a long time. Very powerful way to work with clients that maybe weren't ready to be doing it in standard. So then you've got your scribbling out, which is bilateral as well. Yep.
Yeah, I think it's so important to acknowledge hardly anything's ever been invented from scratch. It's how we
Mhm.
put all the pieces together and move them around and emphasize one piece over the other. And I certainly, in the models that I've done, as I said earlier, I didn't invent the thing. I just modified and fine-tuned some things, and I think Francine was gracious enough to introduce all these things to me, and then at some point in time when it felt like I have to fly the airplane the way I need to fly the airplane, or hit my tennis ball the way I need to hit my tennis ball. Um, it's lots of ways to do it, and it was just like this is kind of the mission of what we want to do. And so I would certainly say all those pieces that I put together for the continuum and the beliefs came from Yuri Bergman, Zangwald, and Jeffrey Young, and Porges. All the pieces you just put them together and you figure out how this works. And I think the other thing for me, as far as how this all came, was I think most of my real growth started probably about 2007 or 8 when I was starting to do almost all training. And, I'd have to say I'm a professional trainer and I don't see clients. My clients are my participants, and everything is how do I help you use this? Because there was too many times when I went to trainings where people were not using it, or afraid to use something, or walked away with their eyes glazed over. And how do we operationalize these wonderful things that Shapiro gave us, along with all these other folks who've contributed, and putting it in a way that makes sense to everyone?
And we've
So
just added the Foursquare and Scribble It Out in the
Great.
chat, and someone linked the
mhm.
video as well.
Good. Yes, thank you
Good.
for that.
Yeah. It takes a
Um,
team, and you've got a wonderful team here with Andy filling in the gaps. Yes, Paula.
yes, and Andy knows this stuff. I was wanting also for you to talk about your accordion. I'm just thinking about the aspects of what you teach that have been priceless for the work that I've done, not only as a therapist, but as a teacher, and what that looks like. Because I want to make sure that we're also honoring EMDR contained, because I don't, during the pandemic, that's all I used. It was a lifesaver. So are you okay with transitioning to that?
Yeah, yeah. And so let's talk with we talked about EMD or
Mm-hmm.
fragmented EMD of that 5 to 10 seconds back to target and taking a sud. And that locks the person down and it minimizes any associations and it
Mm-hmm.
minimizes any emotion. And when you need to use that, it's almost like you have to use it. It's more like I have to use it more often than anything else. Contained processing would be slightly different in that the client shows you when you're interviewing, they've got pretty good compartmentalization skills. They got pretty well life management. They're not coming in Maslow's level of crisis. They're a little bit higher up the chain, so to speak. And you could have a person coming in with just a recent loss, a loss of a job maybe, but they're not dysregulated when they tell this story. And they might, or they've had, they're in the middle of sudden loss of relationship. And it would be nice to get history, but that's not where they are. It would almost be disingenuous and non-therapeutic to even suggest you go there. But you want to give them some relief that we get through processing, and you realize that they can benefit from some insights and thoughts and self-reflection. Well, EMD won't allow you to do that. It because you're getting suds all the time, and so it shuts down that. So you can modify and expand down, and this is where the EMD with a lowercase r came to play, that you want to get some degree of reprocessing. That's why I made it a lowercase r to represent there's some reprocessing here that is happening under the opportunity to give some insights and reflective comments and listening. So what's different there is I might say, bring up the fact that your partner just said they were leaving you or whatever. And we still go through the phase 3 assessment. Let me back up for a moment. I skipped one important thing. In EMD, we want to keep the body offline. We want to keep history offline. So if you have a very dysregulated client on your phase 3 questionnaire that you use to light the system up, do not ask for the body. The body is the umbilical cord that will run off you into the abyss. So that's the one qualifier, especially in that situation where you've got problems that could come up if they tap into them. Okay, that having been said, I know you're relatively healthy, you're relatively functional. I may not know anything about your history, but you've come in and you're really upset with the fact that you're dealing with this sudden disclosure of a trauma, whatever it happens to be, a divorce, or you just lost your job, or something on that order. But you show some pretty good degree of compartmentalization, and you introduce this process we call EMDR, and I would still put it under the umbrella of EMDR, that it's going to be a way to help you kind of get some relief from that, maybe connect, make some adaptive connections. Are you willing to try that? So now, following my general rule, I want to do a little bit more stimulation because EMD is this, contain is this. We got little knuckles of
Oh,
association. You like that one? Just,
yeah, I like that one. Oh my
yeah.
gosh,
So
yes,
yeah,
okay.
so EMD is this, EMD contained is this, and EMDR is that. Okay. So
Love
it's
it.
a nice little way to look at things.
Yep, yep.
So I want you to be able to experience that. So I'm going to increase the duration a little bit more, maybe a third more. So if I were doing 10s, my general rule of approach for restricted, I may do 15. And again, you're just guesstimating this. For those of you who have a lot of practice experience, and you have a pretty good rhythm of how long it goes, go a little bit longer. And then the second part is to now remind them of the incident. You want to keep them on task because you don't know what else is there. This is sort of like my target is my hand. I don't know what's in my forearm under my sleeve. I don't know that. So I don't want to give them the opportunity to go off task. So I will again ask you anything that comes up other than your boss telling you you're fired, you stop me. So, assuming that's, you start your stimulation, when you stop at the set, I don't want free association. So I'm going to say, now, when you think about your boss firing you, now I want some reflective thought. So I'm going to say, what do you notice? Remember, if I ask you a SUD, I lock down reflective thoughts as an EMD. So I want to now give you a chance to notice what you're experiencing. So the set would be to go a little longer. Now think about your boss firing you. What do you notice? Think about your boss firing you. What do you notice? And you just do that as long as there's incremental change. And eventually it gets down to hardly anything. And now for the first time, I'll take a SUD. And then now when you think about your boss, it's where is it now, 0 to 10? If they say zero, great. More often than not, they might say a two or three. Now, here you have to think about what do we do when we go back to target and take a SUD, and it's only a two or a three. In standard, we push for more, don't we? Well, I don't want to push for more because that's offline. So I'm going to have to qualify that question. I might say, now when you think about being fired by your boss, on a scale, on a scale of 0 to 10, how much? And it's a three, it's a two. Do you think that two is relating still to being fired by your boss, or are there some things that might be related that we really haven't talked much about? And if they say the boss, fine, do a set. Again, stop me if anything other than your boss comes up. However, if they say, I think it's the stuff we haven't really talked about, I'm seeing some connections. You are done with that phase. And then you go on to insulation, you strengthen insulation. And then when you get to the body scan, you're going to ask the same qualifier questions. When you think about being fired by your boss, scan your body, notice what you feel. Does that feeling you having in your tummy feel like it's related to being fired by your boss? Or do you think it goes somewhere else? If it goes somewhere else, thank you very much, we're done. Again, let me cycle back as I'm filling in pieces. In EMD, I'm not even going to do a body scan. In EMD, I may or may not get things to go lower than the number they give you. And I probably wouldn't even ask to get it any lower. I'm happy that we've gotten any relief we can with an EMD, very dysregulated client. I'm happy to get whatever we've gotten. And that could be going from a 9 to a 7. You're not going to get these huge changes because EMDs are just little pieces of a bigger piece. You're doing fingernails of the whole hand. I'm doing these little things. I'm not doing the hand. I'm doing a finger or a fingernail of one finger. So we know there's a lot of stuff there. So that's that qualifier. Now, if they stop me, we're doing contained processing. They say, "Whoops, something else just came up." I'm going to say, let's put that away. Let's put it away in a container. Let's imagine you block it off. Or I might say, okay, just focus on that event. And now I'm going to accordion down to next set's going to be an EMD set. I'm going to only do 5 or 6 seconds because I've guesstimated, I did about 12 seconds before they stopped me. I'll do EMD sets or a CID set. Just think about the event, how much it bothered you, and I'll take the belief offline. That sort of pulls the neural network offline a little bit. And then I'll do a short set, and I'll say, now when you think about your boss, how much does it bother you? So you can see we have this accordion that allows us to go down more. That accordion also plays itself out in standard EMDR when you're working through clients processing. And if it gets to be into their window and exceeding their window, I would go right to contain restricted, and then slowly pull it back up again if I'm hitting your window. Also, as a quick reminder, the other thing that came out of the processing continuum was this whole approach about a window of tolerance. And the commonly accepted window of tolerance in the psychotherapy community is hypo at the bottom, standard normal processing, and then hyper at the top. That does not make sense in EMDR. If you think about exposing a client to more and more stress, you start off normal, or you start off not being able to get started, and then as you get exposed to stress, you're getting into hyperarousal. Can I flee? Can I run from this? If you can't run, and I continue to push you up, continue to say, go with that, go with that, go with that, then you're going to feel maybe you're a fight. You might want to say, I don't want you, we won't fight. You should say, stop, I've had enough. But if you don't, it goes from the flight to fight to what, numb. And then if the stress continues out in the wild when the animals attacking you, you go numb, and then you start to you go collapse, and then you fall. What is it? What is it? Fight, freeze, fight, flight, freeze, then numb, and then you collapse, hoping your body lays there dead, and the thing is going to eat you. And then if the trauma still goes, you go up. So our processing continuum starts off normal or under accessing is where I just don't have enough of the information. And that's where you might have to prime them a little bit to get it started. But remember, you're going all the way up into those other things. Okay. So you
And
can
I'd
see
like
the
to,
continuum.
I want to say one thing here, Roy, because it's a compliment to you. One of the reasons why I love working for Roy, I do work for Roy, is because he is a forward thinker. He is a critical thinker, and he shifted from the window of tolerance to, more of a polyvagal stance, because that's what polyvagal tells us. You move into the hyper, then you shut down and go into hypo. And his trainings reflect that. We're teaching that in the trainings. And I just love that once you were able to make that shift, then you put it in your basic training so that we can be teaching window of tolerance correctly. And so thank you for that.
Well, you're welcome. One reframe. We work together. You don't work for me. We work with one another.
Well, anyway, but thank you.
Okay. So I hope that you can see this whole kind of process of how you look at your client, and it all falls into play with the neurological makeup. It all goes back to AIP. It really goes back to Francine's terminology of AIP. And that was 10 years before we even knew about neural networks. And then everything else just kind of says, okay, this is a refinement and expansion of AIP. What is happening? And the more dramatic you have things here, the earlier it starts. And the more dramatic the encoding was at the beginning. So I have a person who has rageful activity now. There was something earlier in their life that would have caused rage that probably they weren't able to do, or they did and was very, very aggressively handled, and now it's coming out. But you just start with that being curious, if you can do it. And then if you can't do the history, it doesn't rule out that they can't benefit from some form of the stimulation that creates a distractor. Could also add one other thing in managing the window, probably prior to even doing the accordion or in combination with the accordion, I think is to take into consideration those things that Susie and Ando John have mentioned with adding layers of distraction. And knowing that when you get into more and more material, your brain gets overactivated and it degrades your ability to process information. And you start to go from that parasympathetic to the sympathetic, and you start to struggle. So, one of the easiest interventions is to start adding a verbal. If I'm doing some type of an eye movement, I want to be more proactive. So, I might say, spell your name backwards. In the middle of you starting to get up into that hyper arousal, I might say, okay, I want you to spell your name backwards while you're following my fingers. And that will pull them down to where you've got all these variations that you can play with. And I think a lot of everything we're doing now in the EMDR community is how do we keep it safer for the client and how do we keep it safer for the clinician? I think often in the trainings, I suggest our newly trained people to recognize you're a beginner, start small. Whether your client can start small or not, you've got to start what you can do as well as what they can do. I think the most intimidating thing from us is the free association where you're not really familiar with what could happen. And a lot of clinicians don't come from backgrounds where they are allowing things to just unfold. I think probably dating back, I mentioned at the start of this session that I was a gestaltist, so I could set a chair up and then it was hang on, let's see what happened. And I was okay with chaos. And now, so doing EMDR, if it went into chaos, it was fine. It wasn't that big of a transition for me out of my comfort zone. But I think more clinicians are now trained in the cognitive behavioral responses and trying to do that. What's different about the window of tolerance is different from EMDR? Well, I think if you look at the standard window of tolerance, it has hypo at the bottom, like you wouldn't opening a window that goes two directions. You open it from the middle, and if it goes in the hyper fight freeze, but then you go down in the hypo as though they're separate directions. And I don't say they're different as I would say processing is. I would say probably 90% of those in the EMDR community, unless they've been trained by us, are going to follow that same window. You still see it.
Mm-hmm.
But
Sure.
what you know is as I start processing you, I've got to get you warm enough to work with the material. One analogy I use is I used to watch Forged in Fire, which was a History Channel show about blacksmiths. And they would be having these different contests. And the blacksmiths have to heat the metal up enough to change its shape before they work with it, but they can't heat it up so much it turns to mush. And that's our task is I got to get you activated enough to get in touch with the event and how much usually the phase 3 questionnaire accomplishes that as much as it needs to. And then you're working within this arena where I want you to feel some emotions and sensations as long as you can tolerate it, as long as you're able to modulate back and forth. Tolerating it to me is your response rate. When I stop, number one, eye movements are great because I can track how your eyes are moving. If you're starting to get a little out of your window, your eye tracking might start to degrade because you're getting pulled into the event too far. The second qualifier is what do you notice? And the person doesn't come back with a relatively timely response. They're having to pull themselves into the present. And then also the affect, and learning how to read affect is what you're looking for. One way to practice that is thinking about anytime you ask a client for a SUD, in your own mind, guess how strong you think that you're reading their body language. And after a little practice, you can get really good at reading the body language, and you'll be within one number, if not right on, as you get to know your client. So as you're doing processing, I'm already picking up your breathing rate, your facial expressions. Are you experiencing fear or are you going into terror? Okay. And as soon as I sense you going up, I'm going to spontaneously pull you down and start to regulate that. And by the way, whenever we're making these accordion modifications, we're not saying I'm changing X to Y. They don't know the difference. You just kind of change. They have no idea, and you're not going to tell them. You don't want them to know that anyway. But you just do it organically and expand it and contract it. And it really is a confidence builder for those who, none of us want our clients to have that high level. Also, while we are talking about these strong emotional responses, a couple other reframes, if I may. The first of which, in the literature, and more often than not, when you hear an EMDR clinician or a trainer talk about these high levels of emotional activation, they call them an abreaction. That is an outdated 1990s terminology, going back to hypnosis, I think. And I looked up the definition. It's repressed memories that are exposed during therapy, and that scares the bejeebers out of me, that I don't want to expose something you didn't know about. I would suggest when we've done a full treatment plan that we know what's in the problem, we know what's in the targets, and we give our client a heads up. We know that processing, and remember memories, this is how Francine told me to hold my hand. We talk about a memory, it has images, but it also has sensations and smells and tastes, along with the belief that encapsulates the whole thing. So if I know that a client is going through a really strong physical sensation that was part of the assault or the abuse, I'm going to give that client a heads up. When we process this through in the standard modality, it's not uncommon that clients feel what they felt during that issue and let them know that so that when that strong sensation comes up, it doesn't scare them, it doesn't embarrass them, it doesn't cause them to want to shut it down. Okay. The other thing, if also, I really am a strong advocate for using my arm for processing. When it's culturally appropriate, I'll use my left arm. This gets into Shore's right brain psychotherapy. You pick up a better attunement when you're looking to your left. You activate your right brain, and that is activating more of an attunement. They're looking to their left because we see it set offside. They're looking to their left, so they're activating your brain. And we have a heightened nonverbal communication. And by the way, EMDR is probably the most elegant interpersonal form of therapy that I have ever exposed to because I'm not in my left brain thinking about what to say to you, nor do I want you in your left brain thinking what to say to me. We want this to be pure organic communication. So having that dance is so valuable. So having said that, if you are using your arm motions for stimulating a person through strong emotional responses, I have found that I'm picking up their body sensations in my own body. I'm feeling what they're feeling. When my shoulder starts to pain me, it's time for us to stop. And so I'll coerce you or talk you down into a pause because I've been talking and moving my hand. And when I train, I talk with my hand all the time, and my shoulder never bothers me. But as soon as I'm working with a client going through that disturbing experiences, my shoulder starts to hurt. And therefore, I think it's time when my pain is such, it's time for us to take a pause. I'm not one that says I'll change arms because to me, that's just modeling to my client that your problems are hurting me. And that client will stop that right away sometimes if they have that feeling. On that same note, with this interpersonal approach, we have nice organized scripts of the negative and the positive beliefs to look at, and people often when they're a little confused working with a client, struggle with that. And I've had clinicians say, here's the list, look at it and pick which ones fit you. I usually don't recommend that. I would rather you model an interpersonal connection and and I will pick the list up and say these as I'm hearing you, these feel like maybe they might fit for you. Which ones seem to fit? There's a question I saw up on chat. Would I be using arm motions on virtual? Generally, I would say no. However, it just occurred to me as this last training, I was listening to somebody. If it depends on what modality they're on, I would have them. If you're familiar with the WeMind EMDR or the WeMind Practice, which are both commercial products produced by those who are produced the WeMind phone. They have a very interactive where you're tapping on the side of your screen when the ball it changes its shape or changes or makes a tone. I would say to the client, if we're doing EMDR right now, I would say to them, and this is challenging because our connection is very slow, at least what I'm seeing you. But I would say when my hand reaches this one side of the screen, you click with your thumb on that side of the screen. And then when I'm on the other side, you click with your other hand, the thumb on that side of the screen, so that I'm making it proactive where you're doing something besides just passively watching. And this really goes back to the distraction that is part of you having to pay attention. So if I were using hand motions, arm motions virtually, my preference would be doing tapping. And aside from my being able to see you, I also know how well our connection's going because I'm watching my own screen right now as I talk, and there's a lag time. And so if my client isn't moving, I know that their screen is frozen for a moment. Okay, so it gives me better feedback than if I'm doing my hand. I can only try if I can see your face close enough. I can watch Paula track me, and I can see that she is. Then I know that. But if we're doing, but I may not be able to see her that well because sometimes clients have, they're again they're on their cell phones. You can hardly see their face. Um, so there's always variations to consider. Um, I also, by the way, if I were doing tapping, I'm always going to do what they do as well. Okay. And focus on that. And I want to be replicating what they're doing. I feel part of that process. That's why I'm not a big proponent of machines if I'm trying to really create an impersonal environment. Okay. All right. We have a few minutes more for questions. I
Yep,
think
I got some
I've given you
questions.
all my EMDR spiels that I do robotically.
Awesome. Yeah, I have some questions and then we'll open it up. Um, can you speak to the movement in the field towards parts work, IFS, IP, NB, etc., and how to work with EMDR and parts?
I can answer that if you'd
I
like, Roy.
can.
You
Yeah,
go
well,
for it.
let
You
me answer
answer, and
one
then I'm gonna.
Yeah,
Yep, go
I
for it.
I think people that are doing that are finding ways that make sense to them to say the same thing, or they're saying it in a way that makes sense to them to their clients to hear what they're trying to say. I have very little experience in that. I think for me, the core belief transcends all of those. So, having said that, I'll defer to Paula to give you some of those.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And I'm just going to give a quick example to make a point. When we're doing EMD and we're going back to target, back to target, back to target and desensitize, you're working with a part. You're working with an energy that is not ready to move into EMDR contained or EMDR unrestricted. So, like Roy said, we're doing the same thing. It's just sometimes we need to put language to what we're doing, and that's what parts work affords us. So instead of utilizing language and the natural healing process of the brain, parts work, you have to do it 21 times for it to click. With EMDR, it's transformational. So we still want you to use as much EMDR as possible, but parts work is helping with the teaching. And to Roy's point, we're doing the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah,
Is
and I
that good,
think
Roy? Or you?
it's using a different term to
Yeah.
say the same thing. Like, as a tennis pro, I learned 25 ways to teach a forehand
Mhm.
because I had to figure out what your language is. And so I think EMDR clinicians come in with their own background, their own filters, their own ways of kind of organizing things. And I think that was where cognitions, for the behaviorists, cognitions made sense to them. But then when they glide out of that, I kind of evolved from cognitions to beliefs. But then others come from ego state work, and now ego state work that goes from another area. So I think
Mhm.
you've got this outgrowth of somatic experiences, part works, internal family systems. All of those are ways to understand how to understand number one, how to explain things to the client, and number two, how to understand how you perceive processing to be
Right.
unfolding,
Yep.
how it makes sense to you.
So I have
And
a
so I
follow
think,
yeah, follow up. A couple people are asking about EMDR alongside other emerging treatments, psychedelics, TMS. What's your take on combining EMDR with modalities like that?
You can
I'm
integrate
going to
EMDR with any.
say that I think the psychedelics are just ways to get to deeper systems to help situations work. I think the exploring, the more we know about the brain, the more ways you know about how it works and how we can help it work, the more you're going to find pieces adding and going into it. And so I think those are all very powerful ways to know that we're doing a lot of brain changing, and how we help facilitate that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, Roy, I mean, integrating EMDR into your clinical practice is the name of our basic training because we know that you're coming to us with strengths and other orientations. And we don't want to say, oh, you're going to ditch that and just do EMDR. We want to integrate it. So whatever you come to the table with, we can figure out how to integrate.
Yeah, when processing pushes a client outside their window of tolerance into shutdown or overwhelm, what interventions do you reach for to bring them back? Things like CPOS or the flash technique, for example?
I think, well, hopefully you might catch the person before they go. I think to me, the flash, if they've already gone through the window, I think you have to reground them and do resourcing and build up the
Hmm.
positive system first and
Hmm.
then do the flash. I think the Flash has to have a fairly stable foundation uh,
Hmm.
because for those not familiar with the Flash, basically bringing up a positive experience, I would say that your positive belief. And then the metaphor analogy I would use is I'm going to imagine running your finger through a flame. If you go through it fast enough, you don't feel the flame at all. So I'm going to have move my hand from one side to the other, and every now and then it'll say blink, a flash, or whatever it is. And you just imagine for that nanosecond your brain dips down into that issue so fast you don't even consciously capture it, almost like the shutter speed of a camera. You set it at a hundredth of a second, it'll catch something even though you're not even aware of it. And sometimes it keeps the polyvagal system online and that allows the system to work. I think we're knowing more and more that you've got to have in that be in that rest and digest kind of polyvagal scenario to keep your prefrontal cortex and your hippocampus online. They have to be online to do the work, and so Flash can take a person who you've anticipated is going to be overactivated. You keep them in that polyvagal environment, keep them well resourced, keep them focusing on their positive belief, how strong that feels, and then you flip in the flash, you can get some symptom relief without activating the system. And it shows you how fast neural networks make. In a nanosecond, that's my understanding, you can connect to what, 20,000 neurotransmitters all connect at 1 second. In a nanosecond, you can accomplish a lot that possibly more focus would overwhelm. That'd be my response.
Awesome. So at this point, I'll ask any last comment from you guys, and then I have some questions to close us out. So anything that you two want to chat about for the next 5, 6 minutes before we go into our sort of end and wrap up, and I have some sort of synthesized questions and comments
Hmm.
back. And for those in the chat, please keep sending questions. We're adding them to our list that we'll go through and answer what we can here. If not, we're going to get written answers for everybody for as a follow up.
Hmm. Yeah, I would just like to say that, there were 450 presentations that were sent to EMDRIA for the conference in August, and 45 were chosen. And one of them is nervous system readiness in EMDR for exactly what we're talking about right now. And in that presentation, it's going to be about the processing continuum. Because as your client is leaving their window of tolerance, if you bring them back to target, or if you get a SUDS, you're engaging that prefrontal cortex. You are ensuring yourself dual attention, which is the cornerstone of EMDR. And that is Roy. That is what Roy teaches, and that is what his basic trainings teach. And I just so appreciate that we've been able to spend a couple hours here just honoring where that came from, the evolution, and where we are today, and how it's going to help us go forward. So that's my final comment. And Roy, yeah.
Well, I think what one has to be able to do is know yourself and have the courage and confidence to try things. I think everything that's happened, even dating back to Francine jumping out and fighting all the battles she had to fight, I think all of us are to own EMDR and modify it and adapt it and make it your own. And you think back when you learn how to write script for those who are still learning how to do that, and how much all of our own personalities affected our handwriting. And so I think there's the necessary fidelity to follow through different things. And then there's the transition for those being trained, how you have to know the fidelity well enough to honor it or defend it or to negate it if you're going through certification. I hope that clinicians have the confidence to say, no, I didn't do it, and this is why I didn't do it. And that, we grow as opposed to have a very narrow, no, you have to do it only this one way, and everything has to stay true. And I think anytime we stand still, we're moving backwards. And I think you've got to have that sense of innovation and confidence just to go out and do that. What about the thoughts about the negative and positive? If you're working with BIPOC, now I think working with any culture or other conversation, you say, how would you want to handle this? If this is happening to you, what are your thoughts? And when we talked about the fact that the positive is more important than the negative, I think if I'm working with somebody in any other type of culture, whatever it happens to be that I'm not familiar with, I would say, well, what would be the response that you would do? One very good, simple question on how to listen the culturally adaptive positive belief for that particular client is to say, if that were one of your friends or a relative or a family member who had that same background as you, what advice would you give them to how to handle that situation? And you're going to get a relatively culturally sensitive response on their regard. And then to ask those questions to understand that, even to the extent of saying, I haven't worked with your this any people with this background. Let's spend a little time helping me understand your culture, how you work through things, the comments you work through, how do you handle this situation or that situation, so that if I'm in unrestricted EMDR and I need to add some clinical comments or suggestions or give you some directions or suggestions to resolve an issue, I'll be saying it in a way that's culturally appropriate. Okay. And so
Awesome.
you want to be able to do that. And I think that's just being that sense of awareness, acknowledgement that's so important in that interpersonal relationship when it feels appropriate. Uh, and bring that up and not try to just bluff your way through or think that if I learn certain strategies, it really becomes quite organic and sensitive to just be able to listen to that. And the most important to me is how would you answer that question? How would you resolve that if you had a friend? And if we often displace, we're not talking about ourselves anymore, but if that were your daughter, your son, if you have a childhood memory, or if that were your friend or colleague, if you have an adult memory, and they were asking advice, what advice would you give them? And almost invariably, maybe with a little bit of prompting, they'll be able to come up with what we consider to be that adaptive belief that would have a good direction to at least start the conversation. The other thing about these beliefs, as much as I've emphasized it, the value is you can fold these in during processing. Don't feel you have to have them well tied down at the start. Even the positive one can be modified and adapted through clinical comments and suggestions that you just slip in all the way through processing. And that's the wonderful thing about us tapping into this adaptive environment where we're creating that unconditional regard. Remember, what we really want to do in EMDR is unconditional regard. There are no supposed tos. That whatever happens, happens, to coin Francine. We're really modeling total acceptance and attunement and validation. And those who have attachment issues and attachment challenges can't be authentic. So we're really validating authenticity. It doesn't matter what you say, I'm going to accept that. And remember, by the way, when we're back to processing, what they're saying, they're working through their issue. It might not be target specific, but it is belief or thematically specific. What I mean by that, if that's not clear, that person has to do it right. It's going to say, what am I supposed to say and what am I supposed to do? And you just say, it doesn't matter what you do or say, just whatever comes up. What's going to happen next might often be, well, I'm thinking about breakfast now. And we have to say, go with that. Because if we redirect you back to target, we just model, no, 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 no. Don't do what I say, do what I want you to do. And part of the subtlety of accepting things is to realize a lot of times they are playing out their own belief issues through our relationship. And so we have to be there. We have to know that the relationship is really important, and we're modeling that, and we're tuning to that, and we're human too, so we can acknowledge when we make a mistake. Want to add one other thing, just a little bit of self-disclosure. People ask about attunement, and I'm of the belief that once you're out of your left brain, which is figuring out what you're doing and just organically responding, you are in a different clinical stance. And Paula might say this too. I've gotten emotional at times. I've gotten teary. I've gotten response because I'm feeling the energy that's changing, but I'm also so attuned to you. I'm not in my left brain thinking about things to say. I really am I am in your right brain through my right brain, and we just have a different awareness. And I think that's a good thing. I think that's a good thing. And that's where, to me, this is such an elegant interpersonal form of therapy, I've said before, that it just allow yourself permission to be that way and give yourself permission to feel that way and not think about I have to all the rights and wrongs and ups and downs and do's and don'ts. Uh, that EMDR is far transcended where we were 30 years ago.
Yeah. Nice. Andy, what
That was
else you
one of
got?
my last. Yeah.
We are going to close out. Sorry, we're having some eval complications. So I'm working on that. So I did send that. If you can't get it, I can email you a PDF you can send back to me and it'll take a little longer, but we'll get you your form. But we have some closing questions. Let me get back to them. Sorry about that. So today we've traced EMDR from a single incident desensitization to an interpersonal framework for neurological integration. Walked through when it went from EMD to EMD little r or full processing, what actually applies, and seen what it takes to adapt for clients who don't fit the standard plan. That arc, evolving, targeted, adaptable, is really the through line through all of what Roy and Paula have shared today. But to wrap it up, we have two final questions. With so many clinicians now being trained at EMDR, do you have any concerns about how the rapid growth affects the quality, credibility, or consistency of the practice? And then the second part of that question, having been trained in 2012, what three things should you no longer do that you were trained to do? So I'll leave those two for you
What
guys.
you
I'm going to
no
answer.
longer do, you say? Okay. 2012. I don't think there's anything you should or shouldn't do. I think what you should give yourself permission to do is modify and adapt and grow and expand. So I think it's looking at the we're not exclusively always doing a single target. I think that's the first thing. Allow yourself to see what's the past could be present. Uh, I think adding the variations of stimulation would be the second. And the third is always attune to your client and do what you feel is clinically appropriate. And that is where EMDR will integrate to a lesser degree. You may not be giving them Prozac, you might be providing them medication cocktail as a treatment cocktail. And give yourself permission to do that, to trust your instinct. So I guess the one thing is don't there are no rules in EMDR. Okay. Just be yourself and be intuitive. You're all wonderful clinicians. Trust that. That may or may not be what an EMDR evaluation for research would say is good, but you're not doing that. So I just give yourself permissions. I think so many, I'm sure Paul has experienced this. So many people who take refreshers have been afraid of breaking the rules and doing it wrong, whatever wrong means. And it's just you're doing therapy and you're doing what you can the best you can and not be restricted by all what you've been told to say or do or not do. That's just be yourself, be genuine and authentic, trust the process.
Trust the process. You know, one of the things that I haven't heard Roy say that I repeat all the time is you're always draining from the same trauma pool. And so whatever you're working on, you know, a lot of times we're thinking, oh, we have to do our target sequence plan or we have to do our treatment plan. What's there? What is it that they say? What's in the way is the way. And so whatever work you're doing and using the processing continuum is what gives you this ability to keep the client where they need to be in their window of tolerance. Whatever work that you're doing, you are draining from that same trauma pool. And so that is what we're looking to do. Meet the client where they're at.
So I'm gonna have one reframe to that,
Okay.
which is you're always dreaming from the same developmental pool.
Oh, yeah. Nice. Nice.
You're always working with that 3-year-old.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Well, and that does speak, you know, not to get into the parts thing, but those exiled parts are those negative beliefs. So yes, nice. So
Always working with
we've
this
got
fractured child.
what's that?
I said you're always working with that wounded child
That's right.
that's trying to
That's
heal.
exactly right.
The safety, connection, and validation. It's the three basic things you're working with. Do I deserve to be here? Am I safe? And can I connect?
Yeah.
That's
Nice.
the human needs we have. And the resilience. Let's not miss that. Last thing. Remember the positive side of the continuum. Multi-generational resilience goes along with the belief system. Just think about the human spirit and the resilience that these clients have who have had really challenges, but there's something innate in them and in the humanness of them that wants to heal them. And we just have a wonderful uh, process to help them do that.
Yeah. So we've got 4 minutes, 3 minutes. Andy, do you want to close us up? Because maybe you have some things to say or
Yep, I am fixing. So for those that have filled out and got the response real quick, it pulled an old certificate that I didn't finish updating. So I fixed that. So you're all getting new corrected 3-credit certificates. Sorry, we cannot give you double credit. But
so
thank you
so they fill it out and then they get it
in
right
an email.
away.
Yep.
Yeah,
So
they get it in
I'll put
email.
the link in the chat again, just so everyone has it.
Yeah, we want you to get your credit.
Unless that's an image. That's an image. I lied. I'm sorry. But yeah, you just fill this out and it will then, once you hit submit, email you back with a CE corrected CE certificate that actually says 3 questions. Or sorry,
You're good.
3 hours.
Andy's got a lot of jobs.
I'm doing a lot right now.
You're
I'm
doing great.
fully mentally taxed, so you've distracted all my parts, and you can all EMDR me anytime you want.
Yes.
Yeah. So for those that already got it, it will send a new one. It's processing those right now. If not, shoot me an email and I'll email it to you directly. We did another question. What are those 3 questions again? Can I connect? Do I deserve to be here? And what was the third?
Am I safe?
Am I safe?
Do I deserve to be here? Am I safe? And can I connect?
Yep.
I need to connect. I need to feel I deserve to be born and live and exist, and I need to feel safe, and I need to feel I have connections.
Yeah.
Nice. And those are kind of our 3 kind of foundational things. And I just want to link those to Paula, to create an environment where I know it's great to have an opportunity to connect. We deserve to be here, and I really appreciate all the work that she's done in a safe, wonderful environment. And I want to thank you for extending the invitation and giving me the opportunity to share. And I hope that this gets shared by everybody else as much as you can as well.
Yeah. And I hope you'd be willing to come back for us to do this again.
Oh, anytime I don't mind talking at all about these things. There's always a wonderful way to grow. And then we're always going when we work with one another. We're there and we heal as much as well. So it's been a wonderful opportunity. Thank you.
Sweet.
Yeah, so if you guys have any questions, concerns, feel free to put them in the eval, or you can shoot me an email, just Andy at either galeconsultinggroup.com or emdrchicago.com, and I'll get them to Paula and Roy. We've been tracking all of your questions, so we'll be sending those out as a follow-up email, and this will go up on the website, on Paula's emdrchicago.com website as soon as it buffers and sends, and I can get stuff put together. So it should be up by tomorrow at the latest.
Nice.
But we appreciate it, and thank you all for coming. And big fat thank you to Roy and Paula for doing this, and Paula for taking a crazy idea and turning it into reality, and Roy for coming along for the ride and providing all the sage wisdom that you've offered.
Nice. Thank you. And if you're at the conference, swing by. I'm going to be talking about the processing continuum, and hopefully I'll have Roy in the front row.
I will be there. As long as they let me in the room, I'll be there.
Absolutely.
So why don't you send this? Can you send this to a channel, a breakout room, Andy? While everybody else is filtering off the call.
Yep. Give me 1 sec. I'm going to stop the recording. We'll be good to go. Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.